Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sports Lab. Today we rate putting on our lab coats to break down one of the most incredible stories in all of sports history, a story of how one family from Brazil took an ancient martial art, remixed it, perfected it, and used it to completely rewrite the rules of combat. We're talking about the Gracie family and the birth of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Now, you've seen it in the UFC, you've seen it in movies, but have you ever really asked yourself how it all started? What if I told you the most dominant fighting system of the modern era was forged not by a giant, but by one of the smallest, sickliest boys in a large family, all thanks to a chance encounter? Born from a favor between a diplomat and a traveling prize fighter? Before we get into the analysis, if you're a fan of the in-depth side of sports, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us continue bringing these stories to you. And we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with a game or play you think we should break down next. Alright, let's get into the game film. To really understand the genesis of this art, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back to a time before pay-per-view, before sanctioned fights, before any of the modern architecture of combat sports existed. You have to go back to the early 1900s, and you have to travel to Japan. This is where you first meet a man named Mitsuyo Maeda. Now, Maeda wasn't just a martial artist. He was a direct student of Jigoro Kano, the founder of Judo. And it's crucial you understand what Judo was at that time. Kano had taken the old, often lethal, battlefield systems of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and systematized them. He created a way of life that could be practiced safely but still retain its devastating effectiveness. Maeda was one of his top prodigies, a master of niwaza, the groundwork aspect of Judo, which many at the time still referred to by the older name, Jiu-Jitsu. Kano had a vision to spread Judo across the world, and Maeda was one of his apostles. But Maeda was a different breed. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a fighter. He left Japan in the early 1900s and became a globe-trotting challenge fighter, taking on all comers to prove the supremacy of his art. In England, Spain, Mexico, Cuba, he fought wrestlers, boxers, street brawlers, anyone who dared to step up. He earned the moniker Konkoma, the Count of Combat, a testament to his prowess. You have to picture the scene, a 5'5" Japanese man stepping into rings and on those stages to face hulking opponents, men who outweighed him by 50, 60, sometimes 100 pounds. And he would win. Here's a specific example that really frames the narrative for you. In 1908, in Havana, Cuba, Maeda was challenged by a famous boxer named Tofano, a man significantly larger than him. The crowd, you can imagine, expected to see the little man from Japan get pummeled. For the first few moments, Tofano chased Maeda around, throwing heavy leather. But Maeda knew the game he was playing. He weathered the initial storm, closed the distance, and clinched. The moment he put his hands on the bigger man, the fight changed. He used a classic judo trip to bring Tofano crashing to the canvas. On the ground, where the boxer was a complete fish out of water, Maeda was a shark. He swiftly locked on an armbar, and the fight was over. This wasn't just a win, it was a proof of concept. It was a live demonstration that technique and leverage could overcome brute strength and size, a theme that will become the very soul of our story. Now, this is where a common misconception often arises. Many people believe the Gracie family simply invented Brazilian Jiu Jitsu out of thin air. The counter-argument and the historical reality is far more interesting. They were not inventors in the traditional sense. They were arguably the most significant innovators and refiners in martial arts history. They took a brilliant, battle-tested product and focused on one specific and arguably most important aspect of it with a singular, obsessive passion. What they received was the seed. The tree they grew was something the world had never seen. The story shifts to Brazil in 1914. As part of a Japanese government initiative to establish immigrant colonies, Maeda arrives in the state of Para. There, his path crosses with a local businessman and politician of Scottish descent named Gustave Gracie. Gustave was a man of influence, a person who could help the Japanese colonists navigate the local politics and get established. He did just that, becoming a crucial ally to Maeda and the Japanese mission. In return for his help, Maeda, a man of honor, wanted to show his gratitude. He couldn't offer money to a man like Gustave, so he offered something far more valuable: knowledge. He offered to teach Gustave's eldest son, a rambunctious teenager named Carlos, the art of Kodokan Judo, or as he often called it, Jiu-Jitsu. You have to pause and appreciate this moment. It's a sliding doors moment in sports history. This wasn't a formal transaction. It was a gift, a thank you, born from a friendship forged in the Amazonian basin. Gastão agreed, and young Carlos Gracie began his training under the Count of Combat himself. Carlos wasn't just learning a set of moves. He was being handed a revolutionary new operating system for human combat. He was learning the very principles Maeda had used to defeat giants across the globe, that the fight always goes to the ground, that a person on their back is not helpless, and that leverage, not strength, is the ultimate equalizer. Carlos absorbed every lesson, not just as a student, but as someone who instantly recognized he had been given a key that could unlock a very different kind of power. He had no idea at the time, but the lessons he learned from Maeda in that small corner of Brazil would become the foundation upon which his family would build an empire and forever change the world of fighting. So you have this young man, Carlos Gracie, who has just been handed the keys to a kingdom he didn't even know existed. Mitsuyo Maeda eventually moves on, continuing his travels, but he leaves behind a fire in Carlos's mind, and here's where the story takes its first crucial turn, where it begins to diverge from its Japanese roots and become something uniquely Brazilian. Because Carlos, you see, was more than just a student or a fighter. He was a visionary. He was a strategist. While other young men might have seen a set of self-defense techniques, Carlos saw the blueprints for an empire. He looked at the principles of leverage, efficiency, and control, and he didn't just see a way to win a fight. He saw a way to live a life and build a dynasty. This is the main analytical point you have to grasp to understand the Gracie story. It was never just about fighting. For Carlos, the art was a microcosm of life itself. The idea of using an opponent's energy against them wasn't just a physical move, it was a business strategy. The concept of patiently improving your position before attacking wasn't just for the mat, it was a philosophy for achieving long-term goals. He was the architect of the entire Gracie project. He understood that for this art to survive and grow, it needed a philosophy, a brand, and a vehicle for expansion. He decided, very deliberately, that this vehicle would be his family. His vision was audacious. He would take the knowledge from Maeda, codify it, and teach it to his younger brothers, Oswaldo, Gastão Jr., George, and the youngest of them all, Helio. They would not just learn jiu-jitsu, they would live it. They would become the living, breathing proof of its effectiveness. The Gracie name itself would become the brand, synonymous with this unbeatable form of combat. In 1925, he took the first concrete step, opening the very first Gracie Academy in Rio de Janeiro. This wasn't just a gym, it was a laboratory. It was the headquarters for his grand experiment. To truly understand Carlos's holistic approach, you only need to look at what's often called the 12 Commandments of Carlos Gracie. These weren't just training maxims, they were life principles he instilled in his entire family. You can see the direct link between the mindset required on the mat and the mindset he advocated for in daily life. For example, one commandment is, be so strong that nothing can disturb your peace of mind. Now, think about that in the context of a fight. When a larger opponent is putting immense pressure on you, the first thing to go is your composure. You panic, you waste energy, you make mistakes. Jiu-Jitsu teaches you to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, to remain calm and think strategically under duress. Carlos simply extrapolated that principle to life's challenges. Another commandment states, look at the sunny side of everything and make your optimism come true. This sounds like simple positive thinking, but in Jiu-Jitsu, it's about constantly looking for opportunities, even from a bad position. When you're on the bottom, you're not just defending. You're looking for the sweep, the submission, the path back to a dominant position. Carlos was teaching his family to apply that same opportunistic, problem-solving mindset to every aspect of their existence. Now, this brings us to a really important perspective shift. When people talk about the technical evolution of BJJ, the name that rightfully comes up is Helio Gracie, the younger brother we'll be focusing on next. The common belief is that Helio was the genius who created the art, and while his technical contributions are monumental, it's a mistake to overlook the foundational role of Carlos. The counter-argument to Helio being the sole creator is that Carlos was the indispensable architect. He was the chairman of the board. He built the entire infrastructure of the academies, the marketing plan, the nutritional philosophy, the family code that allowed Helio's technical genius to flourish. Without Carlos's grand vision and his business acumen, Helio's innovations might have remained a personal secret, a clever solution for a small man, but not a global phenomenon. Carlos built the stage, and he knew he needed a star performer to prove the concept. He started by teaching all his brothers, turning the Gracie siblings into a formidable team of instructors and fighters. They were his field researchers, testing and refining the techniques in the academy and in real fights. But his gaze soon fell upon the most unlikely candidate to become the face of this powerful new art, his youngest brother, Helio. From a young age, Helio was a stark contrast to his more robust brothers. He was small, thin, and chronically sick. He would suffer from dizzy spells and fainting fits, and doctors advised him against any kind of strenuous physical activity. So, while his brothers were training and fighting, little Helio could only watch from the side of the mat, forbidden to participate. You can just imagine this frail boy sitting on the sidelines day after day, year after year, observing every single detail. He wasn't just watching, he was analyzing. He was absorbing the art intellectually, breaking it down in his mind, long before his body was ever able to perform the moves. Carlos had his vision, he had his academy, and he had his team of fighters. But in his sickly younger brother, he had, unknowingly, the perfect crucible of mind and body that would be forced to push the art, core principles to their absolute limit. So you have this fascinating dynamic unfolding at the Gracie Academy. Carlos is the visionary, the grand strategist laying out the family's path to dominance. His other brothers, Oswaldo and George, in particular, are the enforcers, strong, tough, talented fighters who are already making a name for themselves in Rio's burgeoning fight scene. And then you have Helio. He's the odd one out, the one who, for all intents and purposes, shouldn't be there. He's on the mat every day, but he's a ghost, absorbing everything through observation because his body is too fragile to participate. You have to put yourself in his shoes for a moment. Imagine having a burning passion for something but being told your entire life that your own physical vessel is inadequate for it. That frustration, that deep yearning to participate, is the fuel for what comes next. The legend, which has become a foundational piece of Gracie folklore, goes like this. One day, Carlos was running late for a private lesson with a prominent student, a director of the Bank of Brazil. Helio, then just a teenager, was at the academy as always, seeing the student waiting and not wanting to disrespect the client. Helio offered to start the lesson. He said, "My brother is running late, but I know all the moves. We can begin." He had never taught a class, never even really trained officially, but he had watched for so long that he had the entire curriculum memorized. He proceeded to give the lesson. When Carlos finally arrived, apologizing profusely, the bank director stopped him. He was so impressed with Helio's clear, detailed instruction that he said, "Your apology is accepted, but if you don't mind, I'd like to continue my lessons with him." This was the moment the floodgates opened. With Carlos's blessing, Helio was finally allowed to put on a gi and officially begin training and teaching. But he immediately hit a wall, a massive, frustrating wall. The techniques that his brothers executed with athletic grace and power simply didn't work for him. When he tried to apply a throw he'd seen Maeda and Carlos teach, his lack of strength meant he could be easily muscled out of it. When he tried certain holds, a stronger opponent could simply power their way free. For anyone else, this might have been the end of the road, a confirmation of what the doctors had always said, but for Helio, it was the beginning of his true life's work. Here's the analytical core of Helio's genius, and it's a beautiful paradox. His physical weakness was his single greatest asset. Because he couldn't rely on strength, speed, or athleticism, he was forced to rely on a perfect application of technique. He became a human filter. He put every single move he had learned under a ruthless microscope and asked a simple question: does this work if I have zero physical advantage? If the answer was no, if a technique required even a small burst of explosive power or a size advantage to be successful, he either discarded it or, more importantly, he re-engineered it. He tinkered, adjusted angles, modified grips, and changed weight distributions until the move worked through pure leverage alone. He was stripping the art down to its most essential, efficient, and undeniable truths. Let's look at a concrete example: the escape from the mount position. In a fight, the mount where an opponent is sitting on your chest is one of the worst places you can be. A traditional escape taught in Judo often involves a powerful, explosive bridge called an upa. You plant your feet, thrust your hips to the sky to launch your opponent forward, and then roll them over. It's effective, but it requires a lot of energy and power. especially if the person on top is significantly heavier. Helio found that against his larger brothers, he could bridge with all his might and they would barely move. So, he developed a different way, a more subtle, technical solution. Instead of one explosive movement, he created a series of smaller, more efficient ones. It's what BJJ practitioners now call the elbow escape or shrimp. He would turn on his side, use his elbows and hands to create a tiny wedge of space, and then snake his knee inside that space, re-establishing a defensive frame. From there, he could methodically work to put the opponent back into his guard. You see the difference? He replaced a power-based solution with a physics-based one. It wasn't about overpowering the man on top. It was about manipulating frames and levers to create space where none existed. Now, a common criticism you might hear from martial arts purists is that Gracie somehow watered down the original, more combat-oriented Japanese Jiu Jitsu. They might argue that he removed the powerful throws and strikes to focus only on the ground. But this perspective misses the point entirely. The counter-argument is that he didn't weaken the art. He specialized it with laser-like focus on a single objective, to provide a realistic path to victory for the smaller, weaker person against a larger, stronger one in a real fight. He wasn't optimizing for a judo tournament against a similarly skilled opponent of the same weight. He was optimizing for a back alley brawl against a raging giant. By removing the elements that were unreliable for a smaller person, he made the remaining system virtually foolproof. He created a system where survival and victory depended not on what you were given at birth, but on what you knew and how you thought. This painstaking process of refinement, this decade-long obsession, turned the Gracie Academy into a true laboratory of combat, and Helio was its chief scientist. But like any scientific theory, it was meaningless until it was proven. The lab work was done. Now, it was time to test the hypothesis in the real world, in the most brutal and unforgiving way imaginable. So, Helio Gracie, the chief scientist, has spent years in the family laboratory, re-engineering this fighting system for a smaller man. He has a hypothesis that his refined, leverage-based jiu-jitsu can defeat any other fighting style, regardless of the size and strength of the opponent. But a hypothesis, as you know, is just a well-argued opinion until it's tested. And the Gracies weren't interested in opinions, they were interested in facts. They needed to move from the controlled environment of the gym to the chaos of a real fight. They needed data, and the way they chose to collect that data was one of the most brilliant, audacious, and brutal marketing campaigns in sports history, the Desafio Gracie, or the Gracie Challenge. You have to understand how radical this was for the time, back in the 1930s and 40s. The Gracies, led by Carlos's strategic mind, took out advertisements in the major newspapers of Rio de Janeiro. These weren't polite invitations for a friendly sparring match. They were brazen, in-your-face challenges. One famous ad read, "If you want a broken arm or rib, your choice, contact the Gracie Academy." It was the physical embodiment of talk is cheap. They were making an incredible claim that their family possessed a superior form of fighting, and they were publicly inviting the entire world to come and try to prove them wrong. This, right here, is the main analytical point. The Gracie Challenge was a marketing masterstroke decades ahead of its time. They weren't just waiting for a promoter to create a platform for them. They created their own platform. They generated their own hype. They controlled the entire narrative. By being the ones to issue the challenge, the call was answered from all corners of Brazil. Fighters from every discipline imaginable stepped up. There were practitioners of capoeira, the dazzling and acrobatic Brazilian martial art. There were boxers who believed their punching power was the ultimate weapon. There were giant street toughs and bodybuilders who relied on pure brute force. And most importantly, there were the practitioners of luta livre, a Brazilian form of catch wrestling that was their biggest and most bitter rival. Each challenge was a clash of philosophies. Could the boxer land a knockout blow before being taken down? Could the wrestler stop the jiu-jitsu fighter's submissions? Could the capoeirista's kicks keep the grappler at bay with every victory? The Gracies provided another data point, another piece of evidence for their case. A win over a boxer proved jiu-jitsu could handle strikes. A win over a wrestler proved it could handle grappling. A win over a capoeira master proved it could handle dynamic, unorthodox attacks. They were building their legend one broken myth at a time. Helio, as the embodiment of the art's principles, became the family's primary champion. Let's look at one of his early, defining fights as a specific example. He was matched against a boxer named Antonio Portugal. Helio stepped onto the mat weighing around 140 pounds. Portugal was a bigger, stronger man, a pure striker. You can picture the scene. The boxer, confident in his power, circling, looking to land that one perfect punch. Helio, calm and patient, looking for his one perfect moment to close the distance. Portugal throws a punch, and in that instant, Helio doesn't block it in the traditional sense. He flows with it, crashing into a clinch. The moment he gets his hands on the boxer, the entire dynamic of the fight shifts. The boxer's primary weapon, the distance required to punch, is gone. Within seconds, Helio uses a simple trip to bring the fight to the floor. On the ground, Portugal is utterly lost. Helio swiftly moves to a dominant position and locks in an armbar. The entire fight, from the first bell to the tap out, lasted about 30 seconds. The crowd was stunned. It was a live, visceral demonstration of the Gracie hypothesis. Survive the storm on the feet, get the fight to the ground, and the outcome is inevitable. Now, it is easy to look back at this and see it through a modern lens and be critical. The common critique of the Gracie challenge is that it was crude, thuggish, and little more than a series of arranged street fights for self-promotion. Some have argued that they cherry-picked opponents or that the fights lacked the legitimacy of sanctioned bouts, but that perspective misses the historical context. The counter-argument is that this brutal method was the only method available to them to prove their point in a world saturated with martial arts mythology. Before the Gracie challenge, the question of which martial art is best was purely theoretical, a debate for dojos and magazines. The Gracies insisted on dragging it out of the realm of theory and into the realm of empirical fact. The challenges were their version of a scientific peer review. They were saying, "This is what we believe. Here is our evidence. Now, please, try to falsify our results." It was a raw, and at times ugly, pursuit of truth. This all-consuming dedication to proving their system's effectiveness permeated every aspect of their lives. Helio and his brothers weren't just fighting for glory, they were fighting to validate Carlos's grand vision. They believed that to be a superior fighter, you had to be a superior human being, and that meant controlling every possible variable. You had to control your mind, your technique, and something else they deemed just as critical, your body's fuel. This obsession with optimization led Carlos to develop another pillar of their system, one that took place not on the mat, but at the dinner table. He believed that the path to victory didn't just run through the academy, it ran through the kitchen. So you have this family, the Gracies, who are operating on a different level. They've taken a martial art, pressure tested it in the real world through the Gracie challenge, and refined it into a system that allows the small to defeat the large. But for Carlos Gracie, the patriarch and visionary, that was only one part of the equation. He believed that what happened on the mat was a direct result of everything that happened off it. He applied the same relentless logic of efficiency he saw in Jiu Jitsu to human physiology. His central question was this: if we are trying to be as efficient as possible with our energy during a fight, why would we be wasteful with our energy in the most fundamental process of all digestion? This question led him down a 65-year path of obsessive self-study and experimentation that resulted in the creation of the Gracie diet. Now, when you hear the word diet, you're probably thinking about counting calories, or cutting carbs, or some other modern trend. You have to throw all of that out the window. The Gracie diet is not about restriction in the typical sense, it's about combination. This is the main analytical point you need to grasp for Carlos. This was the ultimate expression of his holistic philosophy. Jiu Jitsu is the art of efficiently managing your body in space against an opponent. The Gracie diet is the art of efficiently managing the fuel you put into your body. He believed that the wrong combination of foods would lead to fermentation and acidification in the digestive system, forcing the body to expend a massive amount of energy to process the meal. That was energy, he reasoned, that could have been used for training, for healing, for thinking more clearly. After decades of research, poring over the work of nutritionists from around the world, and using himself and his family as test subjects, Carlos codified his findings into a set of simple, yet rigid, rules. The system is built around several food groups. Group A, for example, includes most vegetables, greens, fats, and proteins like meat and fish. Group B consists of the starches. Group C is made up of sweet fruits. There are other groups for acidic fruits and different types of milk, and so on. The core genius of the diet, and its primary rule, is that you never combine foods from the same group in one meal, and you never combine starches Group B with sweet fruits Group C. The idea is to create meals that are chemically compatible, allowing for the smoothest and most efficient digestion possible. He also stipulated a minimum of 4.5 hours between meals, with nothing in between, to ensure one meal was fully processed before the next one was introduced. Let's use a simple, specific example to make this clear. Imagine a classic dinner: a grilled steak, a baked potato, and a glass of orange juice. To most of us, that sounds pretty healthy, but to Carlos Gracie, it's a chemical disaster. The steak protein is Group A. The potato starch is Group B. Combining Group A with Group B is acceptable. The problem is the orange juice, an acidic fruit. According to the diet's principles, that acidic element would clash with the starch, causing fermentation. A Gracie-approved version of that meal would be the steak with a huge side of grilled vegetables and a salad, all from Group A. Or, you could have the baked potato with vegetables Group B combined with Group A. The components are the same, but the combination is key. It was a radical way of thinking. It's not just what you eat, but how you combine it. Now, you're probably thinking, what does modern science have to say about this? And that's the fascinating counter-argument. Many modern nutritionists and dietitians would dismiss the concept of food combining as pseudoscience. The scientific consensus is that the human digestive system is perfectly capable of breaking down mixed meals and that the body tightly regulates its own pH levels, regardless of the food you eat. There are very few, if any, peer-reviewed clinical studies that validate the specific chemical theories behind the Gracie diet. But here's the Gracie response, and it's the same one they use for their fighting style. Forget the lab, look at the results. Their argument is purely empirical. They would point to Carlos Gracie, who lived to be 92. They would point, most famously, to Helio Gracie, who was still healthy, sharp, and teaching jiu-jitsu seminars from the mat at 95 years old. They would point to generations of fighters who swore by the diet, claiming it gave them more energy, faster recovery times, and incredible longevity in a brutal sport. For them, the proof was not in a scientific paper, but in the living, breathing legacy of their family's vitality. Whether you believe the science or not, you cannot deny the powerful role it played in forging their identity and their unwavering self-belief. It was another layer in their armor of invincibility. It was one more variable they could control in a world of chaos. So now, the foundation is complete. You have the brutally effective fighting system refined by Helio. You have the crucible of the Gracie challenge to prove its worth. And you have the underlying nutritional philosophy of the Gracie diet to fuel the machine. With all these foundational pillars in place, we can finally zoom in. We can put the art itself under the microscope and ask the most important question of all. Why does it work? What are the fundamental principles of physics and biomechanics that allow a 150-pound person to utterly control and submit a 250-pound person? It's time to break down the science of the gentle art. Alright, so we've established the Gracie family's unique philosophy, a system of fighting, a marketing engine, and a diet, all built on the core principle of efficiency. Now, we're going to zoom in and get our lab coats dirty. We're going to pop the hood on jiu-jitsu and look at the engine itself. The question we left with was, why does it work? How can a 150-pound Helio Gracie systematically dismantle opponents who are bigger, stronger, and more athletic? The answer isn't some kind of martial arts magic or ancient secret. The answer is science. It's the cold, hard, and beautiful application of physics to the human body. The main analytical point you have to understand is this. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is a system designed to treat a fight not as a contest of aggression or strength, but as a dynamic physics problem. It's a series of equations involving leverage, structure, pressure, and momentum. The person who understands and manipulates these forces more efficiently will always have the advantage, regardless of the muscular power they possess. Helio and Carlos weren't just fighters. They were intuitive physicists, and the mat was their laboratory. They figured out that an opponent's strength, which seems like their greatest asset, is actually their greatest liability if you can control the structure that supports it. Let's break down the three core physical concepts. First, and most important, is leverage. You've probably heard the famous quote from the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, "Give me a lever long enough, and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." In BJJ, your limbs, your arms, and your legs are the levers. The fulcrum can be one of your opponent's joints, or it can be a part of your own body, like your hip. By creating a lever and a fulcrum, you can multiply the force you generate exponentially. You're not trying to bench press the opponent off you. You're using a simple machine to lever to manipulate their body with a fraction of the effort. The second concept is base and posture. Think of a skyscraper. Its strength comes from its solid foundation, its base, and its structural integrity, its posture. The human body is the same. Your ability to generate power is directly linked to your connection to the ground, your base, and the alignment of your spine, your posture. If you're standing flat-footed with your back straight, you're strong. If you're off balance and hunched over, you're weak. So, a huge part of the jiu-jitsu game is an obsessive focus on breaking your opponent's posture and disrupting their base while constantly maintaining your own. Once their structure is compromised, their muscles can't fire effectively. Their strength becomes almost useless. You've effectively unplugged their power source. The third concept is weight distribution. This is about being heavy where it matters. A 150-pound person can feel like they weigh 300 pounds if they apply all their weight onto one small point. Think of the difference between someone stepping on your foot with a snowshoe versus a stiletto heel. The person's weight is the same, but the focus pressure of the stiletto is immense. In BJJ, you learn to use your entire body weight, channeled through a specific point like your elbow, shoulder, or knee, to pin and control a much larger person. It's not about being heavier, it's about applying your weight more intelligently. Let us see all three principles converge in one of the most classic BJJ techniques, the armbar from the guard. Picture this, you're on your back, and your opponent is between your legs and your guard. Breaking posture. First, you don't let them sit up straight where they can punch you or generate power. You use your legs to pull their hips in and your hands to control their upper body, forcing them to hunch over. Their skyscraper is now crumbling. Their posture is broken. Creating the lever and fulcrum, you then swing one leg high up on their back to further control them, and you pivot your body. You place your hip directly underneath their elbow joint. Your hip is now the fulcrum. Their arm is the lever. Applying leverage, you secure their wrist with both of your hands, and you bring your other leg over their head to completely isolate the arm and prevent them from escaping. Now, you've trapped the lever. To finish the submission, you don't have to be strong. You simply lift your hips off the ground. This tiny movement applies an impossible amount of force to their elbow joint, forcing them to either tap out or suffer a severe injury. You can see how your entire body is working as a system to isolate and attack one tiny, vulnerable point. It is pure physics. Now, the common counter-argument you'll always hear from people unfamiliar with grappling is, that's great, but a really strong guy would just power out of it, and on the surface. That sounds logical. Strength is a powerful tool, but that argument fundamentally misunderstands the goal. The counter perspective is that BJJ techniques are not designed to meet strength with strength. They are designed to negate strength. The whole point of breaking the posture and isolating a limb in the armbar example is to put the opponent in a position where their biceps, their chest, their shoulders, all their big, powerful muscles are taken out of the equation. You've created a scenario where the strength of their entire body is pitted against the structural integrity of a single joint. It's a battle they cannot win. The system was born from the assumption that your opponent will be stronger, so every technique is pre-engineered to solve that exact problem. This entire philosophy of neutralizing strength and creating control through leverage is embodied in one revolutionary and often misunderstood position, a position that turns all conventional wisdom about fighting on its head, a position that suggests that being on your back, the place where every other martial art tells you you've already lost, can actually be the most dangerous place to be. We're talking, of course, about the guard. So, we've just broken down the core physics of jiu-jitsu, leverage, base, posture, and weight distribution. And as we closed out, I mentioned that there is one position, one concept, that serves as the ultimate expression of all these principles combined. It is a concept so revolutionary that it basically took thousands of years of established fighting wisdom and turned it completely upside down. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to first appreciate the universal, undisputed truth of combat before the Gracies came along. If you are on your back, you are losing. Period. In boxing, it's a knockdown. In wrestling, you're seconds away from being pinned. In a street fight, it's the most vulnerable position imaginable, open to kicks, stomps, and devastating ground and pound. For all of human history, the goal was to stay on your feet, and if you fell, to get back up as fast as possible. Being on your back was synonymous with defeat, and then came the Gracies, who looked at this absolute truth and said, no, you're all looking at it wrong. This, right here, is the analytical point you cannot miss. The development and systematic application of the guard is the Gracie family's single most profound contribution to the evolution of martial arts. They took the worst possible position in a fight and transformed it from a defensive last resort into a complex and dangerous offensive platform. They created a complete system of fighting off your back, a web of levers and controls that can neutralize, frustrate, and ultimately defeat a larger opponent who was on top. It was, and still is, a complete paradigm shift. So what is the guard? In its simplest form, it's the use of your legs to control an opponent from your back. The most basic version is the closed guard, where you have your ankles locked together behind your opponent's back, effectively wrapping them up with your legs. Now, you might be thinking, how does that help? This is where the physics we just talked about comes into play. First, it's about distance management. Your legs are longer and, for most people, significantly stronger than your arms. By having your opponent inside your guard, you control the distance. You can pull them in tight, clinching them so they can't generate any power for punches. Or, you can use your legs to push them away, creating the space you need to get back to your feet. You are the one dictating the range of the engagement, even though you're on the bottom. Second, it completely destroys their posture. Remember how we said an opponent's strength is useless without good posture? The guard is the ultimate posture breaking machine. By clamping down with your legs and pulling with your arms, you can force your opponent to be constantly hunched over, their spine curved, their base compromised. They spend all their energy just trying to sit up straight, while you remain relatively relaxed, using the strength of your entire lower body to control them. And third, it's an offensive launch pad. Once you've controlled the distance and broken their posture, a whole universe of attacks opens up. You can use their now unstable base to sweep them, using your legs as levers to reverse the position and land on top, or you can launch a vast array of submissions, chokes, and joint locks that are uniquely available from the guard. For a perfect, real-world example of the guard's power to nullify a dangerous specialist, you have to look at Royce Gracie in the final of the very first UFC against the Dutch striker Gerard Gordo. Gordo was a formidable Savate practitioner and karateka. The fight hits the ground, and Gordo gets on top of Royce, right inside his guard. For anyone watching in 1993 who didn't understand Jiu Jitsu, this looked like the end for Gracie. The striker was on top, in a position to rain down blows. But then you see the guard in action. Royce uses his legs to control Gordo's hips and his hands to control his head, pulling him down and completely neutralizing his ability to strike effectively. Gordo becomes so frustrated and confused by this control that he resorts to illegally biting Royce on the ear. Royce, unfazed, remains in control, weathers the storm, and eventually uses the position to reverse Gordo, get them out, and finish the fight with a rear naked choke. You see it right there. The guard wasn't just a defensive shell to survive in. It was a weapon that completely disarmed a dangerous striker and created the path to victory. Now, in the world of modern MMA, you'll often hear a counter-argument. Critics and even some fans and judges see a fighter pulling guard choosing to go to their back as a passive or even negative tactic. Because modern scoring criteria heavily favor the fighter who is on top, the guard can be seen as a losing strategy in a sport context. But this perspective confuses the rules of a specific sport. With the fundamental principles of combat, the counterpoint is that the guard wasn't invented to win rounds on a 10-point must system. It was invented to save your life and win a no-rules fight. When you find yourself in the worst possible situation, on the ground with a bigger, stronger attacker on top of you, in its purest application, it remains one of the most brilliant strategic innovations in martial history. The genius of the guard and of the Gracie system as a whole is that it's part of a larger, logical progression. It's not about just throwing up a submission from a bad spot and hoping for the best. It's about following a strategic roadmap. There is a clear hierarchy of positions, a methodical path you take from a neutral or bad position to a dominant one where you can finish the fight safely. This core tenet, this patient, strategic climb up the positional ladder, is known as position before submission. We've established the guard as BJJ's great paradigm shift, the system that turns the ground into a dangerous web of control for the person on the bottom, but the art's strategic brilliance goes much deeper than that. The guard, as revolutionary as it is just one piece of a larger, more profound philosophy, a simple three-word mantra that forms the very strategic soul of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu: position before submission. If you only remember one thing about the BJJ mindset, it should be this: it's the art's prime directive. its core operating principle, and it's what truly separates it from many other martial arts. The main analytical point here is that BJJ treats a fight like a game of chess. The goal isn't just to snag a victory in a chaotic scramble. It's to methodically improve your position, neutralize your opponent's threats, establish overwhelming control, and then, only when the outcome is nearly certain, apply the finishing move. It's a philosophy built on risk mitigation and energy conservation. Why take a 50-50 gamble on a submission from a neutral position when you can follow a step-by-step process that leads to a 99% chance of success? Every step is designed to make you safer and your opponent weaker, slowly tightening the noose until there is no escape. To really appreciate this, you have to understand the alternative, what you see in other grappling arts and even with less experienced BJJ practitioners. It's the submission over position mindset. This is the fighter who, from a bad or unstable position, will desperately lunge for a submission. They'll go for a guillotine choke while standing, and if they miss, they get taken down and end up on the bottom. They'll try to grab an armbar from a scramble, and if they fail, the opponent passes their guard and puts them in a terrible spot. It's a gambler's mentality. It's exciting. It can occasionally lead to a spectacular finish, but it has a low percentage strategy that often costs a massive amount of energy and results in a worse position than you started in. The Gracie philosophy is the absolute antithesis of this. It is patient, suffocating, and ruthlessly logical. So what is this positional roadmap? You can think of it as climbing a ladder with each rung representing a more dominant position. At the bottom of the ladder, you have the guard, which we just discussed. It's a powerful defensive and offensive position, but you're still on your back. From here, your primary goal is to sweep your opponent to get on top, which moves you up the ladder. Once you're on top, the first major checkpoint is side control. Here, you are lying perpendicular across your opponent's chest, your weight pinning them to the mat. You are controlling their hips and their head. From here, they have very few ways to attack you, and you are relatively safe. It's a great position, but it can be better. The next rung up is the mount. Now you're no longer beside your opponent. You're sitting directly on their torso. You have gravity as your greatest ally, and your entire body weight is crushing down on them. You have a huge arsenal of submissions available, and their escape options are far more limited. For them, it's like trying to get out from under a car. But even the mount is not the pinnacle. The top of the ladder, the checkmate position in Jiu Jitsu, is the back mount. Here, you are on your opponent's back, with your arms wrapped around their neck and your legs hooked around their waist for control. Think of yourself as a backpack they can't take off. In this position, you are in zero danger. They cannot hit you. They cannot submit you. Meanwhile, all of your primary weapons, your arms for choking, are aimed directly at their most vulnerable target, their neck. This is the ultimate expression of the Jiu Jitsu strategy: total control, zero risk, and the highest probability of a successful finish for a specific, grueling example of this philosophy in action. Look no further than Royce Gracie's legendary battle against the monstrous Dan, the Beast Severn at UFC 4. Severn was a 250-pound Greco-Roman wrestling powerhouse. The fight hits the mat, and Royce finds himself on the bottom, in his guard. With this massive man on top of him, for over 15 minutes, Severn held Royce down, looking to land strikes. A lesser fighter, a gambler, would have panicked. They would have desperately and repeatedly tried for armbars or chokes from the bottom, draining their own energy and giving the powerful wrestler opportunities to pass the guard. But what did Royce do? He followed the prime directive. He maintained his position. He stayed in his guard, controlled Severn's posture to minimize damage, and conserved his energy. He was patient. He waited, trusting the system. After 15 long minutes, Severn finally made a small positional error. Royce seized the opportunity, not to just grab a limb, but to use his legs to secure a triangle choke, a position where his legs trapped the opponent's head. And one arm, he secured the position first, locking it in tight, and only then did he apply the fight-ending pressure. It was a masterclass in patience and strategy. Now, a counter-argument you'll see in the modern, hyper-athletic world of sport jiu-jitsu is that this classical hierarchy is too rigid. You'll see elite competitors using incredibly dynamic, almost acrobatic, moves to enter into submissions like leg locks from seemingly nowhere, appearing to bypass the ladder altogether. But that's a bit of an illusion. The counter perspective is that these athletes have such a deep understanding of the fundamentals that their positions are simply more transitional and subtle. They are still securing a form of control before they attack, even if that control only lasts for a split second. For 99% of practitioners, and especially in a self-defense situation, the slow, methodical climb up the positional ladder remains the most reliable, energy-efficient, and safest path to victory. And so, once you've patiently climbed that ladder, once you've reached the summit of the mount or the back, it's time to end the fight. It's time to apply the tools that make jiu-jitsu so definitive. It's time to analyze the anatomy of the finish itself. We've climbed the ladder of positional dominance. We've followed the prime directive, position before submission. Now, we've arrived at the top. We're in the mount, or we've taken the back. We have established complete control. The opponent is neutralized, their offense is gone, and their defense is crumbling. It's time to end the fight. It's time to look at the tools jiu-jitsu uses to force a definitive conclusion. These tools are the submissions, and they represent the ultimate expression of the art. Its efficiency and its power is a great equalizer, because unlike a punch, which can be absorbed by an opponent with a granite chin, or a slam, which can be endured by someone with a high pain tolerance, a properly applied submission presents a simple, binary choice: concede defeat, or suffer catastrophic systemic failure. Your toughness does not matter. This is the main analytical point you must understand about the finish in BJJ. The submissions are not designed to cause pain. Pain is often an immediate and overwhelming byproduct, but it is not the primary mechanism. Instead, BJJ submissions are designed to bypass an opponent's willpower and pain threshold entirely by attacking the body as fundamental operating systems. You have two main categories of attack. You can attack the circulatory system that supplies blood to the brain, or you can attack the mechanical integrity of the skeletal system. It's not about being tougher than your opponent. It's about presenting them with an inescapable physiological or mechanical reality. Let's break down the first category, chokes, or more accurately, strangulations. Now, it's crucial here to distinguish between an air choke and a blood choke. An air choke is what you see in movies, where someone's windpipe, the trachea, is crushed. This is painful, terrifying, and surprisingly difficult to do on a resisting person. BJJ focuses on the far more efficient and effective method, the blood choke. This technique involves applying precise pressure to the carotid arteries on the sides of the neck. When you compress these two arteries, you are cutting off the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain. The effect is staggeringly fast. The brain, deprived of its fuel, begins to shut down. The person will lose consciousness in about 8 to 10 seconds. You can see why toughness is irrelevant here. You cannot will your brain to function without blood. It's not a question of grit. It's a question of physiology. It's like a light switch being turned off. The perfect example of this is the rear naked choke, often called the king of all submissions. From the back, mount that ultimate position of control. You slide one arm under the opponent's chin. The blade of your forearm rests against one carotid artery, and your bicep presses against the other. You then lock your other hand behind their head to create a powerful lever with a gentle squeeze. You apply 360 degrees of pressure to the neck, and the fight is over. It's clean, it's quiet, and it is absolutely undeniable. The second category of submissions is joint locks, where a choke attacks the body's circulatory system. A joint lock attacks its mechanical structure. The principle is simple. Isolate a single joint, the elbow, shoulder, knee, or ankle, and use the power of leverage to bend it in a direction it was not designed to go. Every joint in your body has a specific, limited range of motion determined by the ligaments and tendons that hold it together. A joint lock is designed to methodically push a joint past that structural limit. Again, you can see why pain tolerance is not the deciding factor. While an armbar is excruciatingly painful, the opponent isn't tapping out because it hurts. They are tapping out because they are being presented with a clear mechanical choice: tap, or your elbow will be hyperextended to the point of dislocation and fracture. You can be the toughest person on the planet, but the ligaments in your elbow have a finite breaking point. It's a question of engineering, not courage. A great example is the armbar we've discussed before. When you have your opponent's arm isolated with your hips as a fulcrum under their elbow, and you begin to lift your hips, you are applying force that their elbow joint simply cannot withstand. They tap to preserve the integrity of their arm. It's a rational decision in the face of inescapable leverage. Now, listening to this, a common counter argument might be that this all sounds incredibly brutal and violent. But from the BJJ perspective, the counter is that this system is actually the most controlled and humane form of one-on-one combat. Think about it. In a striking art like boxing, the primary goal is to render your opponent unconscious by inflicting concussive trauma to the brain. Every knockout is, by definition, a brain injury, and the cumulative effects of this are well documented and tragic. In Jiu Jitsu, the vast majority of fights end with a tap of conscious, voluntary admission of defeat. The system has a built-in release valve. The goal is to establish a position of such overwhelming control that your opponent is forced to quit, ideally without any serious injury occurring at all. The potential for a catastrophic finish is the threat, but the practice of the art is centered on the safety and mutual respect signified by the tap. These devastatingly effective finishing tools, the chokes and joint locks, weren't developed in a vacuum. They were refined, tested, and perfected over thousands of hours of live training. And fighting inside the walls of a specific place, this institution became the heart of the BJJ world, a crucible where theory was forged into fact. We're talking about the original Gracie Academy in Rio de Janeiro, the epicenter of a martial arts earthquake. So we have this arsenal of brutally effective submissions, all governed by a chess master's strategy of positional dominance. But you have to remember, these concepts weren't just written in a book or theorized in a boardroom. They were forged in sweat, under pressure, day after day, year after year, inside the walls of a single institution that became the heart, soul, and brain of the Jiu Jitsu revolution. This was the Gracie Academy in Rio de Janeiro. To understand the art, you have to understand the place that gave birth to it. You have to picture what this place was like, especially in its early days after Carlos first opened its doors in 1925. This wasn't a modern, chrome and steel fitness club with juice bars and rows of treadmills. This was a crucible. It was a small, dedicated space, probably humid and smelling of sweat and determination. It was the family's headquarters, their laboratory, and their sanctuary all in one. It was the physical manifestation of Carlos's vision, and the mats of that academy were the canvas on which Helio painted his masterpiece of leverage and technique. Here is the main analytical point that you can't miss. The original Gracie Academy was far more than just a martial arts school. It was a complete, self-contained ecosystem for combat innovation. Think about it. It served three functions simultaneously. First, it was a teaching facility where the principles were passed on to students. Second, it was a research and development lab where Carlos and Helio and their brothers would constantly tinker with, refine, and even invent new techniques. And third, it served as a fire management agency, the home base from which they launched the Gracie challenges. This created a perfect, rapid-fire feedback loop. A technique could be theorized in the morning, taught to a student in the afternoon, tested against a resisting training partner that evening, and then validated in a real, no-holds-barred challenge fight that weekend. The results of that fight, what worked, what didn't, would be brought right back to the academy on Monday to be analyzed and used to refine the curriculum. This is what allowed their jiu-jitsu to evolve at such a blindingly fast pace. A key ingredient in this evolutionary soup was the academy's core training methodology: live, full resistance sparring, or what practitioners today call rolling. This was a radical departure from many traditional martial arts of that era. If you walked into a typical karate or kung fu school at the time, you would have seen students practicing kata prearranged forms and movements performed in the air. You would have seen them practicing choreographed drills with a compliant partner. The Gracie's approach was fundamentally different. They believed that you could only learn to fight by fighting. From day one, the training was built around applying techniques against a partner who was actively resisting and trying to apply their own techniques to you. This created an incredibly honest learning environment. There was no room for fantasy or ineffective, flashy moves. If a technique didn't work under pressure against someone trying to stop you, it was discarded. Only the most efficient, high-percentage techniques could survive in that kind of unforgiving, Darwinian environment. Let's walk through a specific example of this methodology. Imagine you're a new student in the 1950s walking into Helio Gracie's academy. You aren't going to be taught a flying kick or a complicated 30-step form. You're going to be taught something immediately practical, like how to escape from the mount. Helio would demonstrate the technique, breaking down the leverage and the specific movements. Then, you would drill it with a partner, but very quickly, you'd be put into a live situation. A more experienced student would get you in the mount. Your only job would be to try and escape. They wouldn't be trying to hurt you, but they would be giving you real resistance. Using their weight and base to hold you down, you would feel, viscerally, why the technique worked, or why you were failing to apply it correctly. This learn, drill, apply under pressure cycle was the engine of progress. It forged skill in the fire of experience, not just theory. Now, from a modern perspective, you can look at this and levy a fair criticism. The culture of the old-school Gracie Academy, by many accounts, was incredibly insular and secretive. They guarded their art jealously. Stories abound of them being reluctant to award black belts to anyone they thought might become a business competitor. They saw their jiu-jitsu as a family trade secret, a kind of crown jewel that had to be protected. The counter-argument, from their perspective, was that this was a necessary form of quality control. They had created something they believed was perfect, a system that could genuinely save lives. They weren't just teaching techniques, they were imparting a life-saving skill and a philosophy. In their eyes, allowing the art to spread without their direct oversight would inevitably lead to it being diluted, misinterpreted, and weakened. Their secrecy wasn't just about business. It was about preserving the purity and effectiveness of the art they had dedicated their lives to building for decades. This academy in Rio was the center of the jiu-jitsu universe. It was the mecca for anyone in Brazil who wanted to learn the truth about fighting. But Carlos's vision was always bigger than Brazil. Helio had proven the art's effectiveness against all comers in his home country. But to truly change the world, they had to prove it on the world's biggest stage. They had to take their family's secret weapon to the United States of America. That monumental task would fall to the next generation, specifically to Carlos's eldest son, Rorion. He would arrive in a new country with a new language, armed only with the family name and the undeniable effectiveness of the art that was now flowing through his veins. His mission, to plant the Gracie flag on American soil, starting not in a grand academy, but in the humble confines of his suburban garage. For half a century, the Gracie Academy in Rio de Janeiro had been the fortress of jiu-jitsu, the heart of a fighting empire that dominated the Brazilian martial arts scene. But a fortress, by its nature, is defensive. The Gracie vision was offensive. It was about expansion. They had perfected their product, and now it was time to take it to the biggest, most influential market in the world, the United States. The man tasked with being the tip of the spear was Carlos Gracie's eldest son, Rorion. And if Helio was the art's chief technical officer, you should think of Rorion as its CEO and, more importantly, its chief marketing officer. He inherited his father's strategic mind and possessed a singular, evangelistic belief in the power of his family's jiu-jitsu. Rorion landed in Southern California in the late 1970s. You have to understand the cultural landscape he walked into. America was in the full throes of a martial arts craze, but it was a craze defined by one man, Bruce Lee. The market was saturated with high kicking, fast punching, visually spectacular arts like karate, taekwondo, and various styles of kung fu. This was the era of Enter the Dragon and Kung Fu the TV series. The American idea of a master martial artist was a guy who could break boards with his head and do a flying kick. Grappling, wrestling, fighting on the ground that was seen as uncivilized, uncinematic, and frankly, ineffective. Rorion arrived with his slow, patient, methodical art of ground fighting and was met with a wall of skepticism. He didn't have the money or the name recognition to just open a grand academy. He worked odd jobs, famously getting roles as an extra in movies and television. But all the while, he was formulating a plan. He knew he couldn't just tell Americans that his family's art was superior. He had to show them. This brings us to the core analytical point of Rorion's genius. He understood that to conquer a skeptical market, he had to replicate the Gracie challenge, but on a micro, grassroots level. He turned his own garage in Hermosa Beach into a modern-day coliseum. It was a demonstration lab, a proof of concept facility, and the beachhead for his American invasion. You can just picture the scene. He laid down some mats on the concrete floor of his garage, and that became the new Gracie Academy. The business model was simple and audacious. He put out the word in the martial arts and Hollywood stuntman communities. He was teaching a style of jiu-jitsu that could defeat anyone, and he put his money where his mouth was, reinstituting the Gracie challenge with a classic American twist. He offered $100,000 to anyone who could beat him or one of his brothers who later joined him in a real, no-rules fight that started on the feet. The door to his garage was literally an open challenge. Let's use this as a specific example, a scene that played out over and over again. Imagine you're a karate black belt in 1980s LA. You're tough, you're skilled. You hear about this Brazilian guy in his garage making these outrageous claims. You think he's a fraud, So you and a couple of your buddies go down there to teach him a lesson. You walk into this humble garage, and there's Rorian, a calm, lean man with a confident smile. The rules are simple. There are no rules, other than no eye gouging or biting. The fight starts. You throw a few kicks and punches, and he just covers up, moving backward, staying safe. You get frustrated, you rush in to finish him, and in that moment, he clinches you. And suddenly, you feel something you've never felt before. You're tied up. Your arms are trapped. Your powerful kicks and punches are useless because you're too close. Within seconds, you're on the ground. You're a black belt, but on the mat, you're a complete beginner. He flows around you, moving from one position to the next, and you feel like you're drowning. Then, he locks on a choke. It's not painful, not at first. It's just a gentle pressure, and then your vision starts to tunnel, and you're frantically tapping on his arm, admitting defeat. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds. You leave not angry, but humbled and utterly mystified, and more often than not, you come back the next week to sign up for lessons. This is how Rorian built his foundation, one broken ego, one converted skeptic at a time. Now, as Rorian's influence grew, so did some controversy. This brings us to a key counter-argument within the jiu-jitsu world itself. Rorian, being a shrewd businessman, made the move to trademark the name Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. This created a significant rift in the family, as other Gracie family members, like his cousin Carly Gracie, were also teaching in the United States and felt the name belonged to the entire family, not one branch. Rorian's perspective, echoing his father Carlos's philosophy, was that this was a necessary step for quality control in the wide-open American market. He believed the Gracie name could be easily exploited by unqualified instructors, diluting the brand and damaging the art's reputation. By trademarking the name and creating a standardized curriculum, he could ensure that anyone learning at an official Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Academy was getting the authentic, proven system. It was a business decision, to be sure, but one he felt was essential to protect his family's legacy. Through these garage challenges and the small but growing group of dedicated students, Rorian was building a powerful word-of-mouth reputation. But he knew this model was too slow. Converting people one at a time in a garage would never change the world. He needed a bigger stage. He needed to replicate the shocking, undeniable proof of the garage challenge on a national, even global, scale. He needed a platform to show everyone, all at once, what happens when a karate master, a boxer, a sumo wrestler, and a jiu-jitsu fighter are all locked in a cage together. The garage had served its purpose. It was time to build an arena. Rorian Gracie has successfully planted the seed of jiu-jitsu in American soil, cultivating it in the small, fertile ground of his California garage. He had a growing list of true believers, converted one by one through the undeniable proof of the Gracie challenge. But a grassroots movement can only grow so fast. Rorian was thinking bigger. He didn't just want to win converts. He wanted to trigger a reformation. To do that, he needed a stage so large and a spectacle so compelling that it would force the entire world to pay attention. He needed a way to put the Gracie challenge on television. This is where he connects with a man named Art Davie, an ad man and creative promoter who immediately saw the explosive potential in Rorian's vision. Together, they refined the concept, a one-night, 8-man, single elimination tournament featuring 8 different martial arts styles to definitively answer the age-old question, who is the ultimate fighter? They pitched the idea to various television executives and laughed out of most rooms, until they landed at Samafra Entertainment Group SEG, a company that specialized in the new and edgy world of pay-per-view with SEG on board. The event had a name, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and it had a tagline that perfectly captured its raw appeal. There are no rules. Now, on the surface, the UFC was presented as an open-ended question, an impartial experiment to see which fighting style would prevail. But you have to look deeper. The main analytical point you must grasp is that the first UFC was not a sport. It was arguably the most brilliant and audacious piece of marketing in combat sports history. It was a carefully designed infomercial for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, cleverly disguised as a martial arts tournament. Rorian Gracie, as one of the event's creators, meticulously architected nearly every aspect of the competition to create the perfect environment for his family's art to shine. The goal wasn't just for the Gracie to win, it was to have them win in a way that seemed so shocking and so profound that it would shatter everyone's preconceived notions of fighting. Let's deconstruct the key elements of this infomercial. First, and perhaps most importantly, there were no weight classes. This was a deliberate and calculated choice. The entire Gracie narrative, going all the way back to Helio, was built on the idea that a smaller, technical fighter could defeat a larger, stronger one by having no weight classes. Rorion ensured that his family's representative would almost certainly be the smallest man in a tournament. A 175-pound Gracie submitting a 250-pound brawler wasn't just a victory, it was a living, breathing advertisement for the core value proposition of their product. Second, the minimal rules. The infamous no rules tagline was, of course, a bit of hyperbole. Biting and eye gouging were officially forbidden, but the lack of rules against things like grabbing the fence, groin strikes in some cases, and headbutts created an environment that closely mimicked a real street fight. This was another strategic masterstroke. Most specialized martial arts thrive within the safety of their specific rule sets. Boxers are protected from takedowns. Wrestlers don't have to worry about getting kicked in the head. By stripping away those rules, Rorion exposed the specialists. He created a chaotic environment where the most adaptable and complete system would prevail, and he was supremely confident that system was his. Third, the fighting surface itself, the octagon, the iconic 8-sided cage, was Rorion's design. Why not a boxing ring? Because a ring has ropes. A fighter can be saved by falling through them, or a grappler can be broken up if they get tangled in them. The fence of the octagon served a specific purpose. It kept the fight contained. There was no escape. It ensured that if the fight went to the ground, it stayed on the ground, which is the world where the jiu-jitsu practitioner is the absolute master. The promotional strategy itself was the final layer of genius. Think about the way the event was framed. This is the perfect specific example. They didn't bill it as Royce Gracie versus 7 other guys. They billed it as a clash of styles. Ken Shamrock, the shoot fighter, versus Patrick Smith, the Taekwondo master, versus Gerard Gordeau, the savate expert, versus Vale Tudo, the sumo wrestler. Jiu-jitsu was presented as just one more variable in the experiment. This framing made the eventual outcome feel like an impartial scientific discovery. It allowed the audience to conclude for themselves that jiu-jitsu was superior, rather than feeling like they were being sold something. It was masterful public relations. Of course, the immediate reaction to the event was shock, and for many, horror. Senator John McCain famously labeled it human cockfighting and launched a political crusade to have it banned. This is the common counter-argument that the early UFC was a barbaric blood sport, devoid of athletic merit. But the counter-perspective, at least from the creator's viewpoint, was that the perceived brutality was a necessary byproduct of the quest for truth. Rorion and Davey would argue that to truly find the most effective fighting art, you had to strip away the artifice of sport. The UFC wasn't about points or judges' decisions. It was about reality. It was a live stress test, and the shocking results were simply the truth of what works in a real fight. The stage was now set. The concept was finalized. The brutal by design rules were in place, and the fighters were being recruited. All the variables were controlled. All that was left was to choose the warrior who would carry the Gracie flag into this ultimate proving ground. And in what was perhaps the most crucial strategic decision of all, the family chose not their biggest, strongest, or most accomplished champion. They chose someone no one would ever expect. So the stage is set for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The brutal, minimal rule format is locked in. The cage is built. The pay-per-view is booked. 8 fighters from 8 different styles are about to collide to answer the question, what is the most effective martial art? The entire event has been meticulously engineered by Rorion Gracie to serve as the ultimate showcase for his family's jiu-jitsu. And now for the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Who would be the Gracie family's representative? Who would carry the weight of a 70-year legacy into the octagon? If you were a betting man in 1993 and you knew anything about the Gracie family, there was only one logical choice. Rickson Gracie, Rickson, Rorion's younger brother, was the family's undisputed champion. He was a mythological figure in Brazil, a warrior with a fearsome reputation forged in dojo challenges on the beaches of Rio and in no-holds-barred Vale Tudo fights. He was bigger than Royce, stronger, more athletic, and by all accounts, possessed a level of technical mastery that was second to none. He was the family's Mike Tyson, an intimidating, ferocious competitor who many believed was the greatest fighter on the planet. Everyone, including the other fighters being recruited for the event, assumed Rickson would be the man to represent the Gracie name. And then Rorion made a decision that was either an act of pure genius or a stroke of incredible luck, depending on who you ask. He did not choose Rickson. He chose another one of his younger brothers, Helio's son, Royce. You have to understand what a shocking contrast this was. Where Rickson looked the part of a killer, Royce looked, well, he looked like a normal guy. He was a slender 175 pounds, soft-spoken and unassuming. He didn't have the intimidating physique or the fearsome aura of his brother. He looked more like a friendly college student or a valet than the world's most dangerous fighter, and that was the entire point. Here is the single most important analytical point about the launch of the UFC. The selection of Royce Gracie over Rickson was a purely strategic marketing decision, and it was brilliant. Rorion understood a fundamental lesson in branding and storytelling. If he had put the fearsome Rickson in the tournament and Rickson had destroyed everyone, the world would have looked at him and said, of course the guy won. He's a monster. He's an incredible athlete. The credit would have gone to the man, but Rorion wasn't selling a man. He was selling a system. By putting the slender, non-threatening Royce into the cage, he created a different narrative. When Royce won, people wouldn't be able to credit his size, his strength, or his athleticism. They would be forced to ask, how is this average-looking guy beating these giants? And the answer would have to be, it's the technique, it's the art, it's the jiu-jitsu. Royce was the perfect messenger because his physical presence didn't get in the way of the message. He was the living embodiment of his grandfather Helio's philosophy, an ordinary man made extraordinary by a superior system. Adding to this powerful visual narrative was another calculated choice, Royce's attire. While the other fighters came out in shorts, singlets, or boxing trunks, the typical garb of a modern athlete, Royce walked out wearing the traditional white cotton gi, the uniform of jiu-jitsu. This served two purposes. First, it was a powerful piece of branding. The gi made him look even more out of place, like a relic from a different era. It visually screamed, I'm not like them, my art is different. It was his pajamas, as the commentators would call them, and they immediately set him and his style apart. But second, and more importantly for the fight itself, the gi was a weapon. The thick cotton collar and sleeves could be used for a dizzying array of grips, to control an opponent. Even more, they could be used as a ligature to choke them unconscious. As with a collar choke, Royce was bringing a hidden weapon into the cage that none of his opponents understood or were prepared for. For a specific example of how this all came together, you just have to watch the opening introductions of UFC 1. The camera pans across the lineup of fighters. You see the hulking, 400-plus pound sumo wrestler, Vale Tudo. You see the chiseled, intimidating physique of Ken Shamrock, the professional shoot fighter. You see boxers and kickboxers who look like they were carved from stone. And then the camera lands on Royce Gracie, standing there in his white gi, looking almost frail by comparison. If you were watching this live in 1993, your immediate thought would be, this guy is going to get killed. And that is exactly the reaction Rorion Gracie was counting on. He had masterfully set the audience's expectations, positioning his brother as the ultimate underdog. He created the perfect setup for the most shocking reveal imaginable. Now, it's worth noting the counter-argument, which comes from within the Gracie family itself. The story is not without its internal politics. Rickson has stated in interviews that he was the original choice, but that a financial dispute with Rorion, who was a primary owner of the event, led to Royce being selected instead. From this perspective, the choice was less about marketing genius and more about a business disagreement. But even if that's true, the counter to that point is that the result of the decision was undeniably a marketing masterstroke, whether by pure design or by a fortunate turn of events. The outcome was the same. Royce became the perfect ambassador to showcase the art, not the athlete. With the unassuming warrior now chosen and the lineup of monsters and specialists assembled, the stage was set. The theories, the marketing, the family legacy, it all came down to this. The bell was about to ring on one night in Denver, Colorado, a night that would not only give birth to a multi-billion-dollar sport, but would forever change the way the world understood fighting. The date is November 12, 1993. The place is the McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado. The lights are bright. The crowd is buzzing with a strange mix of curiosity and bloodlust, and the pay-per-view broadcast is live. The experiment has begun. Rorion Gracie's carefully constructed infomercial is on the air, and his unassuming brother, Royce, is about to step into the eight-sided cage. What unfolded over the next couple of hours was not just a series of fights, it was alive. televised dissection of martial arts mythology. Each of Royce's 3 victories that night served as a unique and brutal lesson, a chapter in a new book of combat that was being written in real time. Royce's first opponent was Art Jimerson, a professional boxer with a respectable record. Jimerson enters the octagon in what has become one of the most iconic and unintentionally hilarious images in MMA history. He is wearing one boxing glove. Just one. His logic was that he wanted to keep his right hand gloved for his power jab and his left hand free for, well, nobody's quite sure. It was a perfect visual representation of how completely unprepared the rest of the martial arts world was for what was about to happen. The bell rings. Royce, patient and composed, moves forward. He doesn't try to strike with the boxer. He simply ducks under a tentative jab, grabs Jimerson's legs, and executes a simple takedown. Jimerson, who has likely never been in this position in his life, lands on his back with Royce immediately passing his legs and achieving the full mount position. And then, the fight ends. Royce hasn't thrown a punch. He hasn't applied a submission. He is just sitting on Jimerson's chest, a position of total control. Jimerson, feeling the crushing weight and the utter helplessness of being pinned to the floor by a man can't get off him, taps out. He quit because of the position. The first lesson of the night was clear. In a real fight, positional dominance can be as definitive as a knockout punch. Next up was the fight everyone was anticipating. Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock. This will be our deep dive, specific example for the night. Shamrock was the co-favorite, a chiseled beast of a man, and a champion from Japan's Pancrase organization. He was a shoot fighter, a practitioner of a hybrid style that blended wrestling with submissions. He was seen as the only other fighter in the tournament who understood the ground game. The fight starts and Shamrock immediately gets a takedown, putting Royce on his back. Shamrock dives for a heel hook, a dangerous submission that attacks the ankle and knee. For the first time all night, it looks like Royce is in real trouble. The crowd leans in. You can see Shamrock cranking on the leg, but this is where you see the genius of Helio Gracie's defensive system. Royce doesn't panic. He calmly defends, using his other leg to control Shamrock's position and alleviate the pressure. He weathers the storm. In a scramble, Shamrock tries to advance his position, and in that split second of transition, Royce sees his opening. He snakes his arm around Shamrock's neck, gets to his back, and immediately sinks in a choke, using Shamrock's onji top, which had come loose. To help secure the hold, Shamrock, the beast, the man who was supposed to be Royce's biggest challenge, is left with no choice but to tap out. The fight lasted just 57 seconds. The second, and perhaps most important lesson of the night, was now proven. Jiu Jitsu wasn't just about taking someone down and getting on top. It was a complete system. You could win from your back. You could win while defending. You could turn your opponent's attack into your own victory. This brought Royce to the finals against the Dutch Savate champion, Gerard Gordeau. Gordeau was the last specialist standing, a terrifying striker who had brutally kicked his way through the competition, famously knocking one of his opponent's teeth out and onto the arena floor. This was the ultimate stylistic showdown Rorion had dreamed of, the pure grappler versus the pure striker. The fight begins and Royce wastes no time. He closes the distance, clinches, and takes Gordeau to the mat. Gordeau, like Jimerson before him, is a fish out of water. He is in Royce's guard and, in a moment of sheer desperation, he bites Royce on the ear. Royce, incredibly, remains calm. He absorbs the illegal foul, maintains control, and waits for his moment. He uses his guard to reverse Gordeau, achieves the mount, and as Gordeau turns to escape, Royce takes his back and locks in the fight-ending rear naked choke. Gordeau taps. Royce Gracie, the smallest man in the tournament, the unassuming warrior in the white pajamas, was the first ultimate fighting champion. The final lesson was the most profound. In a real fight, a world-class striker's skills are completely nullified once the fight hits the ground. Now, looking back with modern eyes, the common critique is that the level of competition at UFC 1 was, frankly, not very good. People will say Royce just beat a bunch of one-dimensional brawlers with no grappling experience. But this counter-argument misses the entire point. The counter is that these fighters weren't low-level at all. They were champions and masters of their own disciplines. The event wasn't trying to find the best mixed martial artist, a concept that hadn't been invented yet. It was designed to expose the flaws of specialized, sport-based martial arts in a real fight setting. The fact that these elite specialists were so thoroughly and easily dismantled is precisely what made the event so revolutionary. It wasn't that the fighters were bad, it was that the system they were facing was that good. The shockwaves from that one night in Denver were felt instantly across the globe. For anyone who had dedicated their life to a single martial art, the question was terrifying. Is everything I know wrong? The pay-per-view broadcast for UFC 1 ends. The lights in the McNichols Arena go down, and the crowd files out into the cold Denver night. Wasn't about the shocking things they've just witnessed. But the real impact of that night wasn't in the arena. It was in the days and weeks that followed. The event was released on VHS, and those tapes began to circulate through the martial arts community like a forbidden text, passed from hand to hand among students in dojos and gyms across America and around the world. Every time someone pressed play, the Gracie family's revolution gained another soldier, and the old world of martial arts crumbled a little bit more. The main analytical point you have to understand about this moment is that Royce Gracie's victory was a global, empirical, and very public refutation of decades of martial arts mythology. Before UFC 1, the question of which art was best was a matter of debate, of theory, of my master could beat up your master. After UFC 1, there was data, there was video evidence. It was a true paradigm shift, a moment of cognitive dissonance for millions of people who had been raised on the spectacle of cinematic fighting. It exposed the vast gulf between the flashy, high-kicking, board-breaking arts popularized by Hollywood and the grimy, unglamorous, but undeniable reality of what works in a real, one-on-one fight. Let's break down the specific myths that were shattered that night. The first and biggest was the myth of the invincible striker. For decades, the common belief, reinforced by thousands of action movies, was that a master striker, a boxer, a karateka, a kickboxer would simply knock out any grappler before the fight ever hit the ground. Art Jimerson and Gerard Gordo were the living test cases for this theory, and the results were disastrous for them. Royce proved that a fighter with a clear strategy for closing the distance could weather the initial storm, get into a clinch, and drag the fight into a world where the striker's primary weapons were rendered completely useless. The second fallacy to fall was the myth of size and strength. The image of the giant brawler, the muscle-bound tough guy, has always been an intimidating one. The assumption was that in a real fight, with no rules, a massive strength and weight advantage would be insurmountable. Ken Shamrock and the 400-pound Tyler Tooley were there to represent that idea. Royce, as the smallest man in the tournament, systematically dismantled this myth. His victories were a live demonstration of Helio Gracie's core principle. That technique and leverage are not just a match for strength and size, but a direct counter to them. Finally, UFC 1 shattered the myth of traditional training. For generations, many martial arts were taught through the practice of kata, beautiful, complex, and prearranged forms performed in the air and compliant to person drills. The belief was that by perfecting these forms, you were developing real fighting ability. But when the specialists at UFC 1 were faced with a chaotic, unpredictable, and fully resisting opponent in Royce, their choreographed training failed them. They didn't know how to react to a takedown, how to defend a choke, or how to escape from the mount, because those things weren't in their kata. It was a brutal validation of the Gracie Academy's core philosophy of live, full resistance sparring. You have to imagine the scene in the weeks following the event. A specific, archetypal story played out in thousands of dojos. Picture a respected, fifth-degree karate master, a man who has dedicated 30 years of his life to his art. He runs a successful school. His walls are covered in trophies and pictures with famous masters. He is the authority on fighting in his town. Then, one of his students brings in the UFC 1 tape. He watches it. He sees the boxer helpless on the ground. He sees the kickboxer getting choked unconscious. He sees this slender man in pajamas dismantle everything he thought he knew about combat. It wasn't just a shock, it was an existential crisis. He was now faced with a terrifying question from his own students. Sensei, can you beat that guy? Can you teach us how to defend against that? It was a moment of truth that forced an entire generation of martial artists to reevaluate their life's work. Now, the immediate counter-argument for many in the traditional martial arts community was to dismiss the UFC as a thuggish, barbaric spectacle, not a true martial art. They argued that their arts were about more than just fighting. They were about discipline, character development, and spiritual growth. The UFC, they claimed, lacked this martial way, or Judo. And while that perspective is valid, traditional arts absolutely offer immense benefits. Beyond pure combative misses the point the Gracies were making. The counter response is that the UFC was never intended to be a test of a martial art's spiritual value. It was a test of its physical value in a fight. The Gracies weren't saying karate was worthless. They were saying it was an incomplete fighting system, and with that one event, they forced the entire world to distinguish between martial arts as a cultural or fitness activity and martial arts as a practical method of self-defense. This shattering of myths wasn't just a philosophical debate that took place in martial arts magazines. It had an immediate and profound impact on how people trained. The age of the specialist, of the pure boxer or the pure karateka believing they had all the answers, was over. That night in Denver proved that to be a complete fighter, you had to be able to handle a fight wherever it went. A new type of athlete was needed, one who could strike, wrestle, and grapple. This forced evolution, born from the shock of Royce Gracie's victory, was the spark that would ignite a global sports revolution. It was the birth of mixed martial arts. The VHS tapes of UFC 1 did more than just shock the martial arts world. They handed it a new curriculum. The old way of thinking of dedicating your life to becoming a master of a single pure style was rendered obsolete in a single night. The terrifying truth that Royce Gracie had revealed was that in a real fight, your opponent doesn't agree to play by your rules. The boxer will get taken down and the karate master will get choked. This realization didn't just end a debate, it started a new sport. The era of the specialist was dead. The era of the mixed martial artist had begun, in dojos and gyms all over the world. The game changed overnight. Fighters who had previously defined themselves as strikers or wrestlers now had to look at themselves as simply fighters, and to be a complete fighter, you had to cross-train. Boxers started learning wrestling takedown defense. Wrestlers started taking kickboxing classes. But there was one art that everyone, regardless of their background, now had to learn. This is the main analytical point you need to understand about BJJ's role in this new landscape. It didn't just become an option in the new sport of MMA, it became the mandatory, foundational pillar. It was the great gatekeeper. You could have Mike Tyson's punching power and an Olympic gold medal in wrestling. But the fighting world now knew that if you didn't know jiu-jitsu, your skills had an expiration date. And that date was the moment the fight hit the mat. You can actually watch this evolution happen in real time if you go back and view the early UFC events. They serve as a perfect fossil record of this rapid adaptation. At UFC 1 and 2, you see Royce Gracie run through a gallery of pure specialists who have no answer for his ground game. The lesson the fighting world learned was simple. You need to know jiu-jitsu. By UFC 3 and 4, you start to see the first adaptation. You see fighters like Kamo Leopoldo and Dan Severn. These guys aren't BJJ black belts, but they are enormous, powerful wrestlers who now have a basic understanding of submission defense. They represent the birth of anti-jiu-jitsu. They can survive on the ground for long periods, making the fights for Royce exponentially harder. The lesson evolved, okay? You don't just need to know jiu-jitsu, you need a specific strategy to counter jiu-jitsu. This leads us to the next great leap, which came around UFC 5 and beyond. With the rise of the first true pro-to-MMA fighters like Don Fry and, most notably, Mark Coleman, these were elite, world-class wrestlers who were now adding striking and submission defense to their game. And it was here that the first coherent, systematic answer to the jiu-jitsu puzzle was created. This strategy, pioneered by Mark Coleman, is the perfect specific example of this evolution, ground and pound. The concept was brutal and effective. Coleman, the godfather of ground and pound, would use his Olympic-level wrestling to take his opponent down at will. But instead of trying to play a technical submission game with the BJJ experts, he would get into a dominant position like the guard or side control, and use his immense strength to posture up and rain down a torrent of punches, headbutts, and elbows. This was a complete game changer. It was the first strategy that acknowledged the reality of BJJ and was built entirely around defeating it. It conceded that the fight would go to the ground, but it sought to turn the grappler-esque world into a striker-esque world by creating space and doing damage. Now, at the time, many BJJ purists lamented this development. This is a fascinating counter-argument from within the grappling community. They looked at the rise of wrestlers using ground and pound and saw it as a brutish, ugly, strength-based tactic that was bad for jiu-jitsu. They wanted to see more beautiful, technical submission battles, a gentle art chess match on the floor. They felt this new style was a step backward, a return to simple brutality over technique. But the counter to that perspective is that the invention of ground and pound was the single greatest compliment ever paid to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. The art was so dominant, so revolutionary that it forced the entire combat sports world to fundamentally adapt and evolve just to survive against it. Ground and pound wasn't a rejection of BJJ's importance, it was a direct, strategic response to it. BJJ was so powerful that it became the central problem that every single fighter, from every other background, had to spend their career trying to solve. This explosion in popularity and its integration into the new sport of MMA created an unprecedented demand for jiu-jitsu instruction. Schools started popping up everywhere, but this success brought with it a new, internal conflict. The art was being pulled into different directions. Was jiu-jitsu's primary purpose for self-defense in a real, no-rules street fight, as Helio Gracie had always preached? Or was its future in this new, exciting, and increasingly regulated world of sport competition? With points, time limits, and weight classes, this question would create a deep philosophical divide that would ripple through the entire jiu-jitsu community, even causing bitter feuds and fractures within the Gracie family itself. The battle for the soul of jiu-jitsu had begun. The success of the UFC and the subsequent explosion in jiu-jitsu's popularity was a double-edged sword for the Gracie family and the art they had so carefully cultivated. On one hand, it was the ultimate validation their family's system had been proven effective on a global stage, and demand for instruction was at an all-time high. But on the other hand, they were beginning to lose control of their creation. As jiu-jitsu spread, it began to change. It was being adapted, modified, and molded to fit the context of this new, exciting sport of MMA and the burgeoning world of grappling tournaments. This rapid evolution triggered a deep, philosophical civil war within the jiu-jitsu community, a conflict that still echoes on the mats today. It was the battle for the soul of the art, self-defense vs. sport. To understand this divide, you have to understand the two opposing philosophies. On one side, you have the purists, a camp best represented by the philosophy of Helio and Rory and Gracie. For them, the art which they specifically call Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is a holistic system of self-defense. The single, overriding criterion for any technique is its effectiveness in a real, no-rules street fight against a larger, stronger, untrained attacker. This means that every scenario must account for the possibility of strikes, multiple opponents, and uneven surfaces like concrete. The goal isn't to score points or win a medal. The goal is to survive, neutralize the threat, and get home safely. This philosophy prioritizes simple, high-percentage techniques, energy conservation, and maintaining positions that offer protection from punches and kicks. On the other side of the divide, you have the sport jiu-jitsu innovators. This movement was championed by other branches of the Gracie family, most notably the legendary Carlson Gracie Sr. and his students. They saw jiu-jitsu not just as a self-defense system, but as a dynamic and evolving combat sport. They embraced the challenge of tournaments with weight, classes, time limits, and a point system that rewarded specific positional advancements and attacks. For them, the ultimate test of the art wasn't just a hypothetical street fight, but a live match against another highly skilled, athletic practitioner of the same art. This competitive furnace incentivized constant innovation and rewarded athleticism, leading to the creation of incredibly complex and specialized techniques. This brings us to the core analytical point. This schism was not just a simple disagreement. It created a distinct evolutionary path for the art. The self-defense path was about reliability. The techniques had to be as foolproof as possible for the average person under extreme duress. The sport jiu-jitsu path was about optimization. It was a constant arms race, with athletes developing new moves and strategies to gain a competitive edge in a very specific, rule-bound environment. You can see this clash in several key areas. Take the concept of the guard, for instance. In the self-defense system, the guard is used to control distance and protect yourself from strikes. Certain open guard positions, where your legs are more active, are used cautiously, because they can expose you to punches. In sport jiu-jitsu, however, you see the birth of incredibly intricate, open guards like the 50-50th guard or the worm guard, where competitors use the G lapel to create a complex web of control. These positions are genius for winning a grappling match, but you would be absolutely insane to try them in a street fight. The perfect, specific example to illustrate this divide is a technique from the modern sport world called the berimbolo. It's a dynamic, acrobatic move where a practitioner, often from a guard position, inverts themselves, going completely upside down to spin underneath their opponent and take their back. In a high-level sport jiu-jitsu match, it is a thing of beauty, a stunning display of athleticism and technique that can score a lot of points and lead to a dominant position. It is a brilliant solution to a problem that exists within the sports meta. But if you showed the berimbolo to Helio Gracie, he would likely shake his head and ask a simple question: what happens when you go upside down on the concrete? Your opponent's friend is standing right there ready to kick you in the head. That single question perfectly encapsulates the two warring worldviews. One sees a brilliant athletic innovation. The other sees a dangerous and impractical sports-specific move that violates the core principles of survival. Now, the modern counter-argument to this great divide is that the two philosophies are not, and should not be, mutually exclusive. A more unified perspective suggests that they are two sides of the same coin, each strengthening the other. The constant, high-pressure laboratory of sport competition sharpens techniques to a razor's edge and builds incredible athleticism, both of which are invaluable in a real self-defense situation. Conversely, a grounding in the principles of self-defense awareness of strikes, focus on control can give a sport competitor a more robust, reliable game that doesn't rely solely on flashy, low-percentage moves. Many of the best schools today teach both, understanding that a truly complete practitioner should be able to navigate both worlds. While this philosophical battle was raging, defining the future of the art, one member of the Gracie family stood almost as a bridge between these two worlds. He was a fighter who was the undisputed living embodiment of the old school, no-holds-barred, self-defense mentality. Yet he chose to prove the effectiveness of that brutal philosophy not in back alleys or closed-door challenges, but on the biggest sporting stages in the world, particularly in Japan, where he would become a living god of combat. This was the family's mythical champion, the man many still consider the greatest of them all, Rickson Gracie. As the jiu-jitsu world was fracturing over the debate of self-defense versus sport, there was one figure in the Gracie family who seemed to transcend the argument entirely. He was the ghost at the feast of the first UFC, the man everyone expected to see, the family's mythical, undefeated champion, Rickson Gracie. While Royce was the perfect messenger, chosen for his unassuming build, Rickson was the message in its purest, most terrifying form. To understand Rickson, you have to understand that he wasn't just seen as a fighter. He was viewed, particularly within his own family, as a kind of warrior philosopher, the highest expression of the art. He moved with a supernatural calm. His training famously incorporated yoga and breathing exercises, and he possessed an intensity that was legendary. Helio Gracie himself, the patriarch and innovator, was famously quoted as saying that while he created the art, it was his son, Rickson, who had perfected it. While Royce was introducing jiu-jitsu to America, Rickson took his crusade to another, equally important martial arts mecca, Japan. In the mid-1990s, the Japanese fight scene was arguably the most sophisticated in the world. Events like Judo and Vale Tudo Japan were hosting no-holds, barred fights that were precursors to the legendary Pride Fighting Championships. Unlike the early American scene, the Japanese audience and fighters had a deep, historical respect for grappling and a hunger for authentic, effective martial arts. This was the perfect stage for Rickson to make his stand. Here is the main analytical point about Rickson's career. His fights in Japan served as the ultimate validation of the original Helio Gracie style of jiu-jitsu, but against a far more evolved level of competition than what Royce faced in UFC 1. The Japanese fighters were not one-dimensional specialists. They were tough, well-rounded martial artists who knew about grappling. They were coming from traditions like shoot fighting and Judo. Rickson's absolute dominance over them proved that the foundational self-defense-oriented, keep it simple style of BJJ was still the superior operating system, even when pitted against opponents who were beginning to understand the new mixed martial arts game. He was the living proof that the old ways were still the best ways. The perfect, specific example of this, the fight that turned him from a martial arts legend into a Japanese national icon, was his showdown with Nobuhiko Takada at the inaugural Pride event in 1997. The build-up was colossal. Takada was one of the biggest stars in Japan, a charismatic professional wrestler from the UWFI League who was marketed to the public as Japan's greatest real fighter. It was a classic Brazil versus Japan showdown, pitting the mystique of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu against the honor of Japanese strong-style wrestling. Over 47,000 fans packed the Tokyo Dome to witness it. The pressure was immense. You can watch the fight today, and what you'll see is a masterclass in emotional control and technical perfection. Takada comes out, circling, throwing tentative low kicks. He's clearly intimidated. Rickson, on the other hand, is the picture of tranquility. He walks forward, patient, his eyes locked on his opponent. He doesn't rush. He doesn't force anything. He simply waits for his moment. After a couple of minutes, he sees his opening. He shoots a simple, clean takedown, puts Takada on his back, and the sporting contest is effectively over. From there, it's a methodical, suffocating demonstration of the jiu-jitsu hierarchy. He passes Takada's guard with ease, achieves the full mount, and as Takada desperately tries to turn away, Rickson transitions flawlessly to an armbar. Takada taps. The fight is over. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. The Japanese crowd, who had come to cheer for their hero, was stunned into a respectful silence, which soon gave way to applause for the master who had so effortlessly dispatched their champion. Rickson won a rematch a year later even more decisively, and his status as a living god of combat in Japan was sealed. Now, from a modern MMA fan's perspective, it's common to hear a counter-argument regarding Rickson's legacy. Critics will point to his official record and argue that his opponents, including Takada, were not truly elite by today's standards. They'll say that Takada was more of a performer than a legitimate fighter, and that Rickson never tested himself against the very best of his era. Most notably Kazushi Sakuraba, the Japanese fighter who would go on to defeat multiple Gracies and earn the nickname the Gracie Hunter. This critique is valid in a sense, but the counter to it is that Rickson's legend isn't just built on his 11 official MMA fights. It is built on a lifetime of rumored gym wars and hundreds of undocumented Vale Tudo and challenge matches in Brazil. His supporters would argue that he could only beat the champions that were available at the time, and in the 1990s, the fighters he faced in Japan were promoted as the absolute best. His aura of invincibility comes from the totality of his career, both seen and unseen. Rickson's fights and the overall rise of this new sport he was helping to pioneer brought a specific technical challenge to the forefront. In the world of MMA, there was no thick, cotton gi to grab. Opponents were slippery with sweat, and the pace was explosive. The traditional grips and controls that were the bedrock of jiu-jitsu had to be modified. This necessity forced the art to evolve in a new direction, leading to the development and refinement of a parallel art form, the art of jiu-jitsu without the jacket, no-gi. Rickson Gracie's dominance in Japan, coupled with Royce's earlier victories in the UFC, solidified jiu-jitsu's position at the top of the martial arts food chain. The world was now convinced, but this new arena of mixed martial arts, the very sport that jiu-jitsu had created, presented a unique and challenging new puzzle. The problem was a simple one of fabric. In the UFC, in Pride, and in the burgeoning no-gi grappling tournaments, there was no traditional gi to grab. The thick cotton jacket, which for 70 years had been an integral part of the art, was gone. Suddenly, fighters were faced with a new reality, a fast-paced, explosive environment against sweaty, slippery opponents. The toolbox had to be redesigned. To truly understand the magnitude of this challenge, you first have to appreciate how central the gi is to the traditional jiu-jitsu game. The gi is not just a uniform, it's a web of handles and levers. You use a grip on the collar to break your opponent's posture and to set up a huge variety of chokes. You use a grip on the sleeve to control their arm, neutralizing their ability to punch or post a hand to defend. You can grab the fabric of their pants to stop them from passing your guard. The friction of the cloth itself slows the game down, allowing for a more methodical, deliberate, and chess-like application of control. Now, imagine all of that is gone. It's like trying to rock climb, only someone has greased up the entire rock face. All your familiar handholds have vanished. This was the problem that led to the evolution of no-gi jiu-jitsu. This is the main analytical point you have to grasp. The development of no-gi was a fundamental adaptation of the art as tactics, driven by a new environment. While the core principles of leverage, position, and submission remained the same, the methods for achieving them had to be completely reinvented. No-gi jiu-jitsu forced a shift in emphasis, away from the static, friction-based controls of the gi and toward the more dynamic, explosive principles of wrestling. The art became faster, more athletic, and more reliant on a different set of grips and controls. Let's break down these specific adaptations. First, the grips, with no cloth to grab. No-gi practitioners had to adopt the natural grips used in wrestling. Instead of a sleeve grip, you have to control the wrist. Instead of a collar grip, you use a collar tie cupping the back of the opponent's neck or underhooks and overhooks. controlling the space under their armpits. When you need to connect your hands to finish a choke or a body lock, you can't rely on holding your own gi. You have to use a gable grip palm to palm or an S grip interlocking fingers. These grips are inherently less secure than a strong gi grip, which means control is more fleeting. This leads to a faster, more scramble-heavy style of grappling. Second, the submissions. A huge portion of the traditional jiu-jitsu arsenal is based on the gi, collar chokes, lapel chokes, Ezekiel chokes all gone. The no-gi environment forced a renewed focus on submissions that attack the neck and limbs directly. The perfect specific example of this is the rise of the guillotine choke. While the guillotine certainly exists in jiu-jitsu, it becomes an apex predator in the no-gi world. It's the perfect weapon for the new meta, which was dominated by wrestlers trying to take jiu-jitsu fighters down. As a wrestler shoots in for a takedown, they lower their head, leaving their neck exposed. A skilled no-gi grappler can instantly snake their arm under the neck, trap the head, and lock up a fight-ending choke. Its prominence in early MMA is a direct result of this clash of styles in a no-gi context. Alongside the guillotine, you saw a huge rise in the popularity of other chokes like the darce and the anaconda, and a massive explosion in the development of leg locks like heel hooks and knee burrs, which don't rely on any fabric to secure. This development, of course, reignited the internal debate within the community. This is the great counter-argument that still exists today, which is better, gi or no gi. The purists will argue that the gi represents the truest form of the art. It teaches a more detailed, technical, and problem-solving approach because the myriad grips create more complex puzzles to solve. They also argue it's more applicable to self-defense, where an attacker will almost certainly be wearing clothes you can grab. On the other side, the no-gi specialists argue that their style is a more realistic simulation of modern MMA and a purer form of grappling, a test of technique and athleticism without the crutch of the gi's friction and grips. The modern, more balanced perspective is that this is a false dichotomy. They are two different sports built on the same foundational principles. The gi teaches patience and methodical control, while no gi builds speed, explosive power, and scrambling ability. A truly complete modern grappler is expected to be proficient in both. This very diversification, this splitting of the art into two distinct but related streams, was a key factor in its global expansion. Jiu-jitsu now had a product for everyone. If you were a traditionalist who loved the chess match, there was the gi. If you were an aspiring MMA fighter or a wrestler who loved a faster pace, there was no gi. This adaptability made the art incredibly appealing to a massive, global audience. The seeds that Carlos Gracie had planted in Rio, and that Rorion had nurtured in his California garage, were about to blossom into a worldwide forest, creating a unique and interconnected global martial arts culture. The creation of no-gi jiu-jitsu was more than just a technical adaptation. It was a final, crucial product diversification. The art now had an offering for everyone: the traditionalist, the self-defense practitioner, the MMA fighter, and the modern sport grappling athlete. With its effectiveness now proven beyond any doubt on the world stage, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu was perfectly positioned to conquer the globe. The fire that had been lit in Brazil and fanned into a flame in a California garage was about to become a worldwide wildfire. The global proliferation of BJJ in the late 90s and 2000s was a phenomenon, and it was driven by a perfect storm of three key factors. This is the main analytical point you need to understand about its growth. First, you had the undeniable proof of concept from the UFC. People had seen it work. Second, you had a decentralized, organic expansion model, almost like a franchise system with no central authority. And third, you had the rise of a new technology that would act as a powerful accelerant: the internet. This trifecta created a feedback loop that allowed the art to spread faster and wider than any martial art before it. Let's look at the expansion model. It didn't happen because of a corporate strategy session at Gracie headquarters. It happened organically through a kind of diaspora. After the UFC, different high-level practitioners from Brazil, many of them from different branches of the Gracie family tree, or their top students, saw the opportunity and emigrated to the United States, Europe, and Asia to open their own academies. You had figures like the legendary Carlson Gracie setting up a school in Chicago, and the highly technical Machado brothers establishing a major presence in California. Each of these masters created their own lineage, their own branch of the Jiu-Jitsu family tree, producing their own black belts, who would then go on to open their own schools. This was coupled with a new phenomenon you could call the Jiu-Jitsu pilgrimage. After watching Royce Gracie on VHS, Martial artists and tough guys from all over the world felt a magnetic pull to seek out the source. A karate instructor from Ohio, a bouncer from London, a judo player from Tokyo. They would all save up their money and make the trip to Southern California, or, for the true purists, to Rio de Janeiro. They would immerse themselves in art for a few weeks, a few months, or a few years, and then they would return home, armed with this revolutionary new knowledge. They'd start a small club in their garage or in the back of a local gym, becoming the sole ambassador for BJJ in their entire region. This is how the art spread, one dedicated student, one small school at a time, creating a global network of interconnected nodes. A perfect, specific example of this diaspora model is the story of the Machado brothers. As cousins of the Gracies, they were steeped in the art from birth. They moved to the United States and, alongside Rorian, helped build the art's foundation in Southern California. But they developed their own unique brand, a highly technical, fluid style of jiu-jitsu combined with a more open and welcoming teaching philosophy. Their success in building a massive network of affiliate schools proved that the art could thrive and grow outside the confines of the official Gracie Jiu-Jitsu trademark. Their students, like the famous Eddie Bravo, would go on to become major innovators and influencers themselves, creating even more sub-lineages and accelerating the art's spread in new and sometimes controversial directions. And then, you pour the gasoline of the internet on this fire. In the early days, it was internet forums and message boards. For the first time, a practitioner in a small, isolated town could go online and discuss techniques with people from all over the world. But the true game changer was YouTube. Suddenly, the knowledge was democratized. You no longer had to make the pilgrimage to Brazil to learn from a master. A world champion could post a video of a new technique, and within hours, it was being drilled in schools on every continent. This created a global hive mind, allowing the art to evolve at a dizzying, collaborative pace. Now, a common counter-argument to this kind of rapid, decentralized growth is that it inevitably leads to a dilution of quality. The dreaded McDojo problem. With so many people opening schools, how could you be sure you were learning from a legitimate instructor? The BJJ community, however, developed a surprisingly effective, if informal, quality control system. The counter perspective is that the art is remarkably self-policing, and the instructor's lineage, who they received their black belt from, is a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. More importantly, the competitive nature of the art provides a constant, public audit. An instructor's legitimacy is often judged by the performance of their students in tournaments. On the mat, you cannot fake it. This culture of the mat doesn't lie has, for the most part, ensured that quality and legitimacy are held at a premium. This global expansion created a vast and diverse new world for the art. It was no longer the secret property of a single family from Brazil. It belonged to everyone. And as the art matured on this global stage, a new generation of the Gracie family was coming of age. They weren't just the children and grandchildren of legends anymore. They were now stepping onto the world's biggest mats themselves, ready to test their family's famous name against a new breed of elite competitor in the very sport their predecessors had created. As jiu-jitsu blossomed into a global culture, a new generation of the Gracie family came of age in a world their grandfathers could have scarcely imagined. They were born into a world where the family name was already legendary, where the art was a worldwide phenomenon, and where the level of competition was higher than ever before. You have to imagine the immense pressure on their shoulders. They weren't just athletes, they were the heirs to a dynasty, carrying the weight of a legacy built on the idea of invincibility. Every time they stepped on the mat, they weren't just fighting an opponent, they were fighting the ghost of their own family's legend. The main analytical point you have to understand when looking at this new blood is how they managed to both honor their family's tradition and adapt to the modern game. They were all grounded in the fundamental, old-school principles of leverage and control. But the game had changed. They were now facing hyper-athletic opponents who had been training in jiu-jitsu since they were children. To succeed, the new generation of Gracies couldn't just replicate the past. They had to innovate on top of it, each finding their own unique way to express the family's art in a new era. Let's look at our first case study. A man many consider to be the greatest sport jiu-jitsu competitor of all time, Roger Gracie. Roger's game is the perfect specific example of this blend of tradition and evolution. In an era where sport jiu-jitsu was becoming increasingly flashy and complex, with inverted guards and acrobatic sweeps, Roger did the opposite. He went back to basics. His style was a throwback to the fundamental, suffocating jiu-jitsu of his ancestors. His game plan was brutally simple and predictable, yet virtually unstoppable. He would take his opponent down, pass their guard, get to the mount, and finish with a cross-collar choke. That was it. He wasn't trying to surprise anyone. He was so fundamentally sound, his application of pressure and weight distribution so perfect, that his opponents knew exactly what was coming and still couldn't do a thing to stop it. He became the most decorated competitor in the sport's history, winning the IBJJF World Championship at black belt an astounding 10 times. Roger's dominance was a powerful, definitive statement that the old-school principles of position before submission were still the most effective path to victory, even against the best modern athletes in the world. He didn't invent 1,000 new moves. He achieved a level of perfection in the original moves that was almost inhuman. Our second case study is Gracie, the son of the mythical Rickson Gracie. If Roger represented the patient, methodical side of the art, Kron embodied its aggressive, predatory spirit. He inherited his father's forward pressure, kill or be killed mentality. Watching Kron compete, you see a relentless hunt for the submission. He is always attacking, always looking for the finish. Most famously with his lightning-fast guillotine and rear-naked chokes, he achieved great success in the sport grappling world, most notably winning the prestigious ADCC tournament in 2013. He then followed in his father's footsteps, transitioning to MMA and competing in Japan before eventually making it to the UFC. Kron's career perfectly illustrates the modern challenge of applying that pure, aggressive jiu-jitsu style to an MMA world where striking and wrestling have evolved to such a high level. He represents the purest continuation of his father's warrior ethos. Our third case study is a trailblazer who shattered barriers and became a massive ambassador for the sport, Gracie. As a woman in a martial art that was, for decades, almost exclusively male, Kyra had to overcome not just her opponents, but cultural barriers as well. As she did so with breathtaking success, she became one of the most decorated female practitioners in history, winning multiple world championships and ADCC titles. With her incredible skill and media-savvy personality, she became the public face of women's jiu-jitsu, inspiring a generation of women to step onto the mats. Her success was definitive proof of the art's effectiveness for women, not just in self-defense, but at the absolute highest levels of athletic competition. She carried the Gracie legacy into a new and vital demographic, ensuring its continued growth. Now, a common counter-argument you might hear is that, despite the individual successes of these great competitors, the Gracie family no longer dominates the sport in the way it once did. If you look at the podiums of the major world tournaments today, they are filled with champions from all over the world, representing hundreds of different teams and lineages. This is true, but the counter perspective is that this isn't a sign of the family's decline. It is the ultimate testament to their success. The Gracie's greatest accomplishment was not in creating a family of champions, but in creating a global art and a global sport. The fact that a kid from a poor neighborhood in Sao Paulo, or a college student from Michigan, or an office worker from Seoul can now rise to become a jiu-jitsu world champion is the ultimate fulfillment of the original vision. The art has become bigger than the family, and that is their true, lasting legacy. This legacy has now expanded far beyond the confines of the competitive arena. The techniques and philosophy that the Gracies pioneered have seeped into the mainstream, becoming a staple of our shared, popular culture. From Hollywood blockbusters to the training regimens of A-list actors, the gentle art is now everywhere you look. The story of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is, at its heart, a story of influence. It's about how one family's ideas influence a city, then a country, and then the entire world of combat sports. But in the 21st century, that influence has broken containment. It has escaped the confines of the man in the cage and has seeped into our shared global culture. The techniques and philosophy first refined in that Rio Academy are now being practiced, celebrated, and emulated in one of the most powerful cultural engines on the planet, Hollywood. To understand the sea change that BJJ brought to action movies, you have to remember what fight scenes used to look like. For decades, cinematic combat was dominated by the aesthetics of traditional, striking-based martial arts. You had the high-flying, acrobatic choreography of Hong Kong Kung Fu cinema, and the powerful, linear movements of karate popularized in the West. A typical action hero would face a dozen bad guys who would politely attack one at a time, only to be dispatched with a single, dramatic spinning kick or a perfectly timed punch. It was spectacular, but it was a fantasy, and after the reality check of the UFC, audiences were becoming increasingly aware of that. This is the main analytical point you have to understand: the rise of MMA and the visibility of Jiu-Jitsu forced Hollywood to get real. Audiences now knew what an actual fight looked like, and the old-school choreography started to look silly and outdated. Directors and fight choreographers began to incorporate the gritty, realistic principles of grappling to create action sequences that felt more visceral, more complex, and ultimately, more believable. BJJ gave them a new language to work with. Fights were no longer just about kicks and punches, they were about clinches, throws, positional control, and submissions. It was the birth of a new era of grounded realism in action cinema. You can see the shift starting in the early 2000s with films like the Bourne series, which traded flashy moves for brutal, efficient, close-quarters combat. But the absolute zenith, the perfect specific example of modern, BJJ-infused fight choreography, is without a doubt the John Wick film series. Keanu Reeves, the star of the franchise, is a legitimate and dedicated jiu-jitsu practitioner in real life, having trained for years with the Machado brothers, and it shows. The fight scenes in John Wick are a beautiful and brutal ballet of what the community has lovingly dubbed gun fu. The next time you watch one of those movies, you'll see it clearly. Wick doesn't just shoot people. He'll engage a henchman, fire a few rounds, and when he's too close to shoot, he seamlessly transitions into a grappling exchange. You'll see him use a classic judo hip throw ogoshi to take an opponent off their feet and send them crashing through a table. You'll see him on the ground, using an armbar not to break the arm, but to control the opponent's body, using them as a human shield while he reloads his weapon. You'll see him apply chokes and joint locks to neutralize one threat so he can engage another. It's a perfect synthesis of striking, shooting, and grappling that feels incredibly fluid and devastatingly real. The John Wick series proved that jiu-jitsu wasn't just effective. It could also be incredibly cinematic, showcasing a level of intricate, problem-solving violence that audiences had never seen before. This on-screen adoption of jiu-jitsu is mirrored by a massive off-screen trend: the explosion of actors, musicians, and public figures who have become passionate practitioners. The list is long and grows every year. You have Keanu Reeves, Tom Hardy, Henry Cavill, Jason Statham, and Guy Ritchie. You have public intellectuals like Sam Harris and podcasters like Joe Rogan, who, as a BJJ black belt and a UFC commentator, has become one of the art's most powerful and influential ambassadors. This celebrity embrace has had a profound effect on the public perception of the art. It helped to detoxify it from its early human cockfighting image, rebranding it as a sophisticated, challenging, and rewarding pursuit. It stopped being just for cage fighters and became human chess, an activity for intelligent, disciplined, and successful people. Now, a purist might offer a counter-argument here. They might say that Hollywood Jiu-Jitsu is a watered-down, choreographed imitation of the real thing, optimized for aesthetics over effectiveness, and, of course, that's true, it is a performance. But the counter to that perspective is that its inclusion in popular culture has been the single greatest marketing tool for the art since the UFC itself. For every one person who might watch a real MMA fight, there are 1,000 who will watch a blockbuster action movie. These films act as the very top of the sales funnel for the entire BJJ community. They plant a seed of curiosity. A person sees John Wick execute a perfect throw and thinks, "What was that? I want to learn how to do that." It demystifies the art and drives countless new students of all ages and backgrounds into academies around the world, all wanting to learn the real thing. As Jiu-Jitsu's star has risen in the mainstream, the art itself has refused to stand still. Back on the competitive mats, far away from the movie sets, a new generation of elite athletes has been pushing the boundaries of what is possible. They are developing hyper-specialized techniques and strategies that would seem like science fiction to the art's pioneers, creating a new kind of jiu-jitsu player, the modern specialist. While Hollywood has been busy turning jiu-jitsu into a cinematic language of grounded realism, the art itself has continued its relentless evolution on the competitive circuit. The image of the everyman BJJ practitioner, like Royce Gracie in UFC 1, has been replaced by a new breed of athlete. The modern elite jiu-jitsu competitor is a full-time professional, a specialist who dedicates their entire life to the perfection of their craft. Their training isn't just about learning moves. It's a scientific endeavor incorporating elite strength and conditioning, sports psychology, nutrition, and meticulous strategic game planning. And the art they are practicing has become so vast and complex that it has led to a new phenomenon: Hyperspecialization. This is the main analytical point you have to understand about the cutting edge of the sport today. The knowledge base of Jiu Jitsu is now so deep that it is virtually impossible for any single person to be a master of everything. The days of the well-rounded generalist are largely over at the elite level. Instead, the modern champion is often a specialist who has built their entire game around a specific, and often incredibly complex, system of techniques. They become a master of a particular position or submission set, and their entire strategy is about forcing the fight by any means necessary into that specific area of their expertise. It is a game of specialists trying to impose their will and drag the battle onto their home turf. You see this most clearly in the major areas of innovation. The first is the world of complex open guards. While the closed guard remains a fundamental position, the highest levels of the sport are now dominated by a dizzying array of open guard systems. You have the De La Riva guard, the spider guard, the lapel guards, and countless other variations. These aren't just defensive positions to be held from the bottom. They are intricate offensive webs designed with specific grips and leg configurations to constantly off-balance, sweep, and submit an opponent. The second, and perhaps most disruptive, innovation has been the leg lock revolution for decades. Attacking the legs, especially with twisting submissions like the heel hook, was considered taboo in most BJJ schools. It was often seen as a cheap or dishonorable tactic, but a new generation of grapplers, most famously systematized by the brilliant and enigmatic coach John Danaher, turned the leg lock game into a sophisticated and devastatingly effective science. They developed a complete system of entries, controls, and finishes that could end a fight in seconds. This completely changed the landscape of no-gi grappling, forcing every serious competitor on the planet to become an expert in both attacking and defending the legs. To give you a specific example of this hyper-specialization, let's look at a technique that perfectly represents the modern, sport-oriented game, the worm guard, innovated by American competitor Keenan Cornelius. You have to picture this to understand how complex the sport has become. The worm guard is a G-based position where the practitioner takes the long, dangling lapel of their opponent's jacket, passes it underneath their own leg, and then grips that same lapel with their opposite hand. This creates an incredibly powerful, pulley-like connection to the opponent's core. It's not just a grip, it's a structural bond. From this position of extreme control, where the opponent can barely move or stand up, the worm guard player has an entire flowchart of sweeps and submissions they can launch. It is a brilliant, almost bizarre-looking system that is purpose-built for the rules and environment of sport jiu-jitsu. It perfectly illustrates the modern trend. It is a technique that is incredibly complex and takes thousands of hours to master. B is almost exclusively useful in a high-level G competition, and C is so powerful that a competitor can base their entire world championship winning game around it. Naturally, this new wave of innovation has its critics. This is where you hear the familiar counter-argument from the old-school purists. They look at things like the worm guard or the intricate leg, locking positions, and dismiss them as fantasy moves that would get you killed in a real fight. They argue that this focus on sport-specific techniques is a betrayal of the art as self-defense roots, creating a generation of athletes who are masters of a game, but not necessarily masters of combat. But the counter-perspective from the modern specialist is that the game has simply evolved. They aren't training to fight an untrained brawler in a parking lot. They are training to defeat other world-class specialists who have dedicated their lives to shutting down the basics. At the elite level, the fundamentals are a given. To win, you must innovate. You must specialize. The sport has become a technical arms race, and these complex new systems are the cutting-edge weaponry required to compete. This incredible evolution of the art, from a self-defense system to a global sport with a mind-bogglingly complex meta, is a testament to its depth. But the story of the family that started it all is equally complex. To get a complete picture of this incredible legacy, you have to look beyond the techniques and the triumphs. You have to be willing to examine the controversies, the internal family feuds, and the criticisms that have been a part of the Gracie story from the very beginning. We've traced the incredible journey of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, from a gift of knowledge in Brazil to a global sport and cultural phenomenon. We've seen the technical innovations, the legendary fights, and the worldwide expansion, but no story of this magnitude is ever a simple, heroic tale. To truly understand the Gracie legacy, you have to be willing to look at it in its full, complex, and sometimes contradictory glory. we have to examine the controversies and criticisms that are as much a part of the story as the triumphs. The main analytical point you have to consider is this: the very personality traits that fueled the Gracie family's rise to the top were also the source of much of the conflict and criticism that has followed them. Their absolute, unwavering self-belief was what drove them to issue the Gracie challenges, but it could also be perceived as arrogance. Their intense, tribal loyalty was what allowed them to function as a unified force, but it also led to bitter internal feuds. Their brilliant and aggressive marketing instincts changed the world, but they were sometimes seen as ruthless and overly commercial. The legacy is complicated because the people who built it were complicated. Let's look at the first major area of controversy, the internal family feuds. Despite the public image of a monolithic Gracie clan, the family has been marked by deep and often public rivalries. One of the most significant was the split between the academies of Helio Gracie and his nephew. Carlson Gracie Sr. Helio's academy traditionally catered to a wealthier clientele and focused heavily on the self-defense aspects of the art. Carlson, a legendary fighter in his own right, opened his academy in Copacabana, and it became a powerhouse famous for producing aggressive, sport-oriented competitors, often from less privileged backgrounds. The two camps developed a fierce rivalry that defined the Rio Jiu Jitsu scene for decades, with different philosophies on training, competition, and the very purpose of the art. Later, as we've touched on, Rory and Gracie's decision to trademark the Gracie Jiu Jitsu name in the U.S. caused a major rift with other family members, who felt he was trying to monopolize their shared heritage. These feuds show that the Gracie Empire was much more like a collection of competing feudal kingdoms than a single, unified entity. The second point of criticism surrounds the machismo and aggression of the Gracie challenge mentality. While it was an undeniably effective marketing tool, it also fostered a culture where disputes were often settled with violence. The history of the Gracies in Brazil is filled with legendary tales of street fights and dojo storms, where members of the family would show up at a rival martial arts school to issue a challenge and defend the family's honor. Critics point to these incidents as evidence of a thuggish or bullying mentality, arguing that the Gracies used their skills to intimidate and dominate the local martial arts scene through violence, not just skill. The line between proving your art and simple street fighting could often become perilously blurry. This leads to a third, and perhaps more nuanced, critique: the accusation of historical revisionism. This is the idea that the Gracie family, particularly the branch that marketed the art to the world, crafted a specific creation myth that aggrandized their own role, while diminishing the contributions of others. The perfect specific example is the story of Oswaldo Fada. Fada was a student of Luis Franca, who himself learned directly from the same lineage as Carlos Gracie. Fada, however, was not a Gracie and came from a poorer background. He dedicated his life to teaching jiu-jitsu to the underprivileged in the suburbs of Rio, often for free. In 1955, Fada's academy, confident in their skills, issued a challenge to the Gracie Academy. When Fada's students dominated the Gracie students, particularly with the use of the leg locks that the Gracies at the time looked down upon, Helio Gracie himself was quoted in the paper as saying, "You need to have a Fada in every neighborhood to show that jiu-jitsu is not the exclusive privilege of the Gracies." Yet, for decades, Fada's story and his contributions were almost completely erased from the mainstream history of the art, a history that was largely written and promoted by the Gracies themselves. Critics argue this is just one example of how the family created a self-serving narrative, downplaying even their Japanese roots to present jiu-jitsu as their own, unique invention. Now, how do you balance these legitimate criticisms with the family's monumental achievements? The counter-argument to all of this is that perhaps these controversial traits were a necessary part of the equation. You have to consider the environment they came from: the rough, unregulated, and hyper-macho world of 20th century Brazil. A more humble, less aggressive, and less tribal group of men might never have had the audacity to challenge the entire world. Their fanatical self-belief might have been the very engine that drove them to innovate and to risk everything to prove their point. It's possible that you can't separate the flaws from the genius. You may not have been able to get the world-changing UFC and the global art of BJJ without the complicated, aggressive, and sometimes ruthless family that willed it into existence. Despite these complexities, despite the feuds and the controversies, the ultimate legacy of the family is not defined by their conflicts. It is defined by the art they gave to the world. And for the millions of people who now wrap a belt around their waist and step onto the mats every day, that art has become something far more profound than just a fighting system. We've navigated the complex and at times controversial history of the Gracie family. We've seen their genius, their feuds, their unwavering self-belief, and their dogged determination. But to truly measure the legacy of what they created, you have to look beyond the family. You have to look at the art itself and the profound, life-altering impact it has on the millions of people who practice it today. Because for the vast majority of them, the journey in jiu-jitsu has very little to do with winning a street fight. It's about something far deeper. The main analytical point you must understand about jiu-jitsu's enduring appeal is this. Its true power lies in its ability to be a vehicle for profound personal growth. The mat becomes a laboratory for life. It is a place where you are forced to confront your physical and mental limits in a direct and undeniable way. In doing so, you learn powerful lessons about humility, resilience, and problem solving that you carry with you into every other aspect of your existence. The art's greatest secret is that it is not really about learning how to fight other people. It's about learning how to struggle with and ultimately overcome challenges. The first lesson every single new student learns is the lesson of forced humility. You can walk into a jiu-jitsu academy on your first day as the strongest, most athletic person in your friend group. You might be a former high school football star or a powerlifter, and within minutes, you will be utterly controlled and submitted by a person half your size who has been training for a few years. It is an inescapable, physical confrontation with the limitations of your own ego. This ego death is a transformative experience. It recalibrates your understanding of strength, teaching you to value technique over brute force, and it makes you a better learner because you have been given undeniable proof that you do not have all the answers. The second lesson is in problem solving under duress. We've called it human chess, and that's exactly what it is. A live sparring session or role is a constantly shifting, high-stakes physical puzzle. Your opponent gets a grip. That's a problem you have to solve. They start to pass your guard. That's another problem. They isolate your arm for a submission. That's a critical, time-sensitive problem. You learn to stay calm in these chaotic situations, to think methodically, and to apply a technical solution while your heart is pounding and your lungs are burning. This ability to maintain composure and think clearly under immense pressure is a superpower that translates directly to your life off the mat. Whether you're dealing with a crisis at work, a difficult conversation, or any of life's inevitable struggles, the third, and perhaps most important, lesson comes from the community. A jiu-jitsu academy is a unique and wonderful place. It's a true meritocracy. For a specific example, just walk into any school during an evening class. You will see doctors rolling with construction workers, lawyers training with college students, and police officers partnering with artists. All the hierarchies of the outside world, wealth, status, profession dissolve the moment you step on the mat. The only thing that matters is the skill and knowledge demonstrated. This shared struggle, the trust required to push each other to the limit and keep each other safe, forges an incredibly powerful bond. The academy becomes a third place for people, a sanctuary away from work and home where they are judged only by their effort and their willingness to learn. Now, a cynical counter-argument might be that this is all just romanticizing a combat sport that is, at its core, about violence, but the counter-perspective and the lived experience of millions is that the daily practice of jiu-jitsu is overwhelmingly collaborative. Your training partners are not your enemies. They are your partners in a shared journey of mutual improvement. You are both working together to solve the puzzle of jiu-jitsu. The fight becomes a metaphor. The struggle to escape a bad position on the mat becomes practice for overcoming a difficult challenge in your life. And so, this art, born from a chance encounter between a Japanese diplomat and a Brazilian businessman, refined by the frailest of brothers and unleashed on the world by a visionary marketing plan, has completed its journey. It has evolved from a family's secret weapon into a global language of personal development, a path for millions to find confidence, calm, and community. It is a legacy of empowerment that has far surpassed even the wildest dreams of its creators. So, what have we learned? We've traced the incredible lineage of an art form from a gift of gratitude in Brazil to a global phenomenon. We saw how the vision of Carlos Gracie and the innovations of his brother Helio created a system designed to empower the weak against the strong. We broke down how that system was unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Through the marketing genius of the UFC, an event that didn't just create a sport, what shattered decades of martial arts mythology. And finally, we've seen how this art of fighting has evolved into something far more profound. A worldwide community and a powerful tool for personal growth. The story of the Gracies and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is a testament to the power of a single, brilliant idea when pursued with relentless, multi-generational passion. The next time you watch an MMA fight or even an action movie like John Wick, I want you to watch it with this new perspective. Don't just see the punches and kicks. Look for the subtle battle of leverage and control. See the chess match on the ground, the constant struggle for position before submission. Understanding the why behind the fight makes it infinitely more fascinating. That's the final whistle for this episode. Until next time, keep watching the game.